Wrong Turn did not emerge from a creative vacuum. It was conceived at a very specific moment in Hollywood horror history, when the genre was experiencing a kind of identity crisis. The late 1990s and early 2000s had been dominated by self-aware, postmodern horror in the mold of Wes Craven's Scream franchise, where characters openly referenced horror movie conventions and the genre folded back on itself in knowing, ironic ways. While that wave had been commercially successful and critically interesting, it had also, by the early 2000s, run its course creatively. Audiences and filmmakers alike were beginning to feel the exhaustion of irony. There was a growing appetite for horror that simply frightened people, without winking at the camera or undercutting its own tension with self-referential humor. It was into this atmosphere that the producers behind Wrong Turn made a deliberate and conscious creative decision. They wanted to go backward in order to go forward. The explicit goal, as announced during the film's development phase in 2001, was to make a 1970s-style horror film. This was not a nostalgic affectation or a marketing gimmick. It was a deeply considered artistic and commercial choice rooted in an understanding of what made horror genuinely effective during that earlier era, and a belief that those qualities had been largely abandoned in the decades since. To understand what that meant in practice, one has to understand what 1970s horror actually was and why it still holds such a powerful place in the imagination of filmmakers and genre enthusiasts. The 1970s were, by almost universal consensus among horror scholars and fans, one of the golden ages of the genre. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, Deliverance, and Eaten Alive drew on a raw, unpolished aesthetic that felt genuinely dangerous. These were not films that reassured the audience of their safety. They did not follow the comfortable rhythms of classical genre filmmaking, where the monster was defeated and order was restored. Instead, they presented a world in which civilization was a thin veneer, easily stripped away, and in which ordinary people could find themselves utterly helpless against forces of violence that operated according to no recognizable moral logic. There was also a strong sociological dimension to 1970s rural horror that Wrong Turn consciously inherited. Many of those films were preoccupied with the anxieties of urban and suburban Americans venturing into spaces they did not understand and could not control. The wilderness, in those films, was not a place of beauty or recreation. It was a place of primordial threat, populated by people who had been left behind by modernity and who regarded outsiders with suspicion, hostility, or outright predatory intent. This tension between the modern and the archaic, between the civilized and the feral, was central to the psychological power of the genre. Wrong Turn's decision to set its story in the forests of West Virginia and to populate its threat with inbred, cannibalistic mountain men placed it directly within that tradition. Development beginnings in 2001 and the Summit Entertainment and Newmarket Group partnership. The formal development of Wrong Turn was announced in 2001, and the announcement itself told an interesting story about the economics and creative culture of early 2000s Hollywood horror. The film was set up as a partnership between Summit Entertainment and Newmarket Group, two production and distribution entities that occupied interesting positions in the independent film landscape. Summit Entertainment, which would later become famous for distributing the Twilight franchise, was at this point a mid-level player with a track record in genre film and a willingness to take calculated risks on projects outside the mainstream studio system. Newmarket Group similarly operated in the space between pure independent filmmaking and commercial genre product, with a portfolio that balanced arthouse ambitions with more commercially-minded projects. The partnership between these two companies to produce Wrong Turn was not accidental. Genre horror, particularly in the low to mid-budget range, represented a reliable investment. The economics of horror have always been favorable to producers willing to work within constraints. The budgets are manageable, the audience is loyal and clearly defined, and a well-executed genre film could return significant profits even without massive marketing expenditure. By 2001, there was also a sense in the industry that the self-aware horror cycle had peaked and that a more visceral, back-to-basics approach could carve out a meaningful niche in the marketplace. The decision to bring Rob Schmidt on as director was significant and reflected a degree of creative ambition behind the project. Schmidt was not a horror specialist by training or reputation. His previous feature, Crime and Punishment in Suburbia, released in 2000, was a loose, stylized adaptation of Dostoevsky's set in contemporary American suburbia. It was a film of genuine artistic seriousness, visually inventive and tonally complex. Hiring Schmidt to direct a slasher film sent a signal that the producers were not content to produce a purely mechanical genre exercise. They wanted a filmmaker with a real visual sensibility and an ability to create atmosphere, not simply execute set pieces. Schmidt brought to Wrong Turn a compositional intelligence and a willingness to let dread build slowly, qualities that would prove essential to the film's effectiveness. The screenplay for Wrong Turn was written by Alan B. McElroy, a writer with deep roots in genre horror. McElroy had been responsible for Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, which had played a significant role in reviving that franchise in the late 1980s, and he brought to Wrong Turn a thorough understanding of slasher film mechanics alongside a genuine interest in pushing those mechanics in directions that felt fresh. The structure of McElroy's script was, on one level, entirely classical. A group of young people find themselves stranded in a remote and hostile environment and are hunted down one by monstrous antagonists. This architecture stretches back to the foundational texts of the genre and beyond them to folklore and fairytale traditions going back centuries, in which the forest is a space of danger and transformation, and travelers who enter it unprepared face terrible consequences. What distinguished his approach was the specificity and coherence with which he developed both the setting and the antagonists. The West Virginia forest in Wrong Turn is not a generic wilderness. McElroy gave it a geographical and social reality, grounding it in the specific landscape and cultural associations of Appalachian America. The decision to set the film in West Virginia was loaded with meaning. The region had long been subject to a particular strain of American cultural mythology, one that associated it with poverty, isolation, and a form of human devolution born from generations of inbreeding and disconnection from mainstream society. This mythology was deeply problematic in many respects, rooted in class condescension and regional prejudice, but it was also genuinely powerful as a source of horror imagery, tapping into anxieties about what happens to human beings when they are cut off from civilization's civilizing influences. The three cannibal hunters of the film, Sawtooth, One Eye, and Three Finger, were conceived by McElroy not merely as monsters but as products of their environment. Their deformities were genetic, the result of generations of inbreeding, and their predatory behavior was the logical endpoint of a complete separation from human social norms. They did not hunt and kill the protagonists out of malice in any recognizable psychological sense. They operated according to a different and utterly alien value system, one in which other human beings were simply resources to be consumed. This made them more disturbing than a conventional slasher antagonist motivated by revenge or psychosis, because there was no negotiating with them, no appealing to a buried humanity. They were simply, terrifyingly, other. The co-production with Constantine Film and its implications. One of the more structurally interesting aspects of Wrong Turn's production history was its configuration as a co-production between Summit Entertainment and Constantine Film, the German production company. Constantine Film was, by 2003, one of the most important production entities in European cinema, with a long history dating back to the 1950s and a portfolio that mixed prestige European art cinema with commercially aggressive international genre product. Constantine had been involved in numerous horror and thriller projects and brought both financial resources and international distribution infrastructure to the partnership. The involvement of Constantine Film in Wrong Turn was part of a broader pattern in early 2000s genre filmmaking, in which American and European production companies found mutual benefit in co-producing horror films. European investment could supplement American budgets, allowing for higher production values than would otherwise be possible at a given price point, while American genre expertise and star casting provided the commercial appeal necessary to justify the investment. For Wrong Turn, this arrangement allowed the production to achieve a level of visual polish and technical ambition that would have been difficult to sustain on a purely American independent budget. The forest sequences, in particular, benefited from the resources available, with location photography that captured the genuine menace of the West Virginia woods with real cinematic craft. The Constantine co-production model also influenced the film's marketing and distribution footprint. Wrong Turn was conceived from the outset as an international product, not simply a domestic American genre film. This shaped certain aspects of the storytelling, encouraging a focus on visceral, visually legible horror that would cross cultural and linguistic boundaries without requiring deep familiarity with American genre conventions. The fundamental terror of being hunted by predatory humans in a dense forest was universal in a way that more culturally specific horror could not be. Stan Winston's creature effects, the art of making monsters real. Perhaps the single most consequential creative decision in the production of Wrong Turn was the hiring of Stan Winston to design the creature effects and serve as a producer. Winston was, by 2003, the most celebrated creature effects artist in Hollywood history, a figure whose work had defined the visual language of cinematic monstrosity for 3 decades. His credits included the Terminator franchise, Aliens, Predator, Jurassic Park, and Edward Scissorhands, a body of work that spanned every conceivable genre and demonstrated an unparalleled ability to create creatures that were simultaneously spectacular and emotionally credible. Winston's involvement in Wrong Turn represented something genuinely unusual for a mid-budget horror film. His work was typically associated with major studio productions with enormous budgets and global ambitions. The fact that he chose to bring his talents and his company's resources to bear on a project of this scale spoke both to his genuine enthusiasm for the genre and to the creative appeal of the challenge. Creating convincing human-derived monsters, beings who were recognizably human but grotesquely deformed, presented a different set of problems from the alien creatures and mechanical robots that had made Winston's reputation, and those problems clearly interested him. The three mountain men of Wrong Turn presented specific and demanding challenges. Their deformities had to be extreme enough to be immediately horrifying and to signal their otherness from ordinary humanity, but they also had to retain enough human quality to be emotionally legible as characters capable of pursuit, cunning, and predatory intelligence. A monster that was simply abstract or inhuman would lack the specific horror of the recognizably human turned monstrous. Winston's genius lay precisely in navigating this tension, creating figures whose faces and bodies communicated both the familiarity of human form and the deep wrongness of its distortion. The practical effects Winston developed for the film were extensive and technically sophisticated. Rather than relying heavily on digital effects, which in 2003 were still developing in their ability to render convincing organic forms, Winston's team created prosthetic makeup and physical appliances that transformed the actors beneath into genuinely frightening figures. This commitment to practical effects was philosophically aligned with the film's overall aesthetic orientation toward 1970s horror, which had relied on practical effects out of necessity and had often achieved greater visceral impact as a result. When you can see something physically real on screen, the body responds to it differently than to a digital construction, however sophisticated. Winston understood this and used it deliberately. His role as producer as well as effects designer also gave him unusual creative influence over the film's overall direction. A creature effects supervisor might design the monsters and execute their visual realization while remaining largely outside the broader creative conversation. A producer shapes the film's priorities, its pacing, its tonal decisions. Winston's dual role meant that the physical reality and visual logic of the monsters were built into the film's architecture from the ground up, not retrofitted in post-production. The creatures in Wrong Turn feel integrated into their environment in a way that is relatively rare in genre horror, and Winston's producer credit is part of the reason for that integration. The cast and its contribution to the film's emotional architecture. The casting of Wrong Turn assembled a group of young actors who brought both commercial appeal and genuine acting ability to roles that could easily have been generic. Desmond Harrington, as the male lead Chris Flynn, was a relative newcomer who brought a physical intensity and psychological credibility to a character who had to function both as a capable action protagonist and as a genuinely frightened human being. His performance grounded the film's more extreme moments in emotional reality, preventing the audience from retreating into pure genre spectatorship. Eliza Dushku, coming off her high-profile television work on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its spin-off Angel, brought star power and action hero physicality to the role of Jesse Burlingame. Dushku had established a screen persona built around toughness, competence, and a certain wary self-possession, and these qualities served the character well. Jessie was not a passive victim waiting to be rescued. She was resourceful, physically capable, and psychologically resilient. A final girl in the tradition established by the film's Wrong Turn was consciously invoking, but updated for contemporary sensibilities about female agency and capability. Emmanuel Tricky, Jeremy Sisto, and Kevin Zegers populated the supporting cast with characters who felt like real people rather than simply bodies designated for elimination. This attention to characterization above and beyond what the genre strictly required was consistent with the overall creative ambition behind the project. When characters feel real, their deaths carry genuine emotional weight. The horror of Wrong Turn depended on the audience caring about its victims, and the cast delivered performances capable of generating that care. The film's place in the horror landscape of its moment. Wrong Turn arrived in theaters in May 2003 at a moment of significant transition in American horror. The previous year had seen the American release of The Ring, Gore Verbinski's remake of the Japanese horror film Ringu, which had become a massive commercial success and initiated a wave of American remakes of Asian horror films. This J-horror influence would shape mainstream American horror for the next several years, with its emphasis on psychological dread, spectral imagery, and a more restrained approach to violence. Wrong Turn represented a counter-tendency, a film that looked not to Japan but to America's own genre past for its inspiration, and that embraced physical, visceral threat rather than the uncanny atmospheric horror of the J-horror tradition. This positioning gave the film a distinctive identity in the marketplace and helped to explain both its critical reception and its commercial performance. Audiences who had been saturated with the atmospheric dread of J-horror-influenced films responded to Wrong Turn's more direct and brutal pleasures. The film did not ask its audience to decode symbolic imagery or process psychological complexity. It asked them to be afraid of concrete, physical danger, and it delivered that fear with considerable craft and efficiency. The critical response to Wrong Turn was mixed, as is almost invariably the case with genre horror that takes its source material seriously but not self-importantly. Critics who brought genre literacy to the film recognized its intelligence and technical accomplishment. Those who approached it from outside the genre's own evaluative frameworks were less impressed, focusing on its violence and its use of regional stereotypes without fully engaging with the tradition it was working within or the skill with which it executed its chosen conventions. What cannot be disputed is the film's lasting cultural influence. Wrong Turn established a franchise that continued through multiple sequels and eventually a complete reboot, suggesting that the original's vision resonated with audiences deeply enough to sustain continued interest. More broadly, it contributed to the early 2000s revival of survival horror and rural horror that would culminate a few years later in The Hills Have Eyes remake, Hostel, and other films of the so-called torture porn wave. Wrong Turn was not torture porn, but it helped to establish the appetites that films of that later movement would attempt to satisfy in more extreme terms. Conclusion: a film that knew what it was doing. What emerges from a close examination of Wrong Turn's development and production is a portrait of a film that was made with genuine intentionality at every level. The decision to return to 1970s horror conventions was not nostalgic laziness but a considered creative strategy. The involvement of Constantine Film gave the production resources commensurate with its ambitions. Stan Winston's participation elevated the creature design from genre competence to genuine art. Rob Schmidt's direction brought visual intelligence and atmospheric discipline to material that could easily have been handled mechanically. Alan B. McElroy's screenplay provided a structural and conceptual architecture that was simultaneously faithful to genre tradition and thoughtfully developed in its specific details. The result was a film that worked both as visceral entertainment and as a genuine contribution to the genre it loved. Wrong Turn understood that the best horror is not simply about shocking or disgusting an audience but about creating a sustained encounter with the possibility of a world without safety, a world in which civilization's protections are stripped away and human beings are left facing forces that regard them with absolute indifference or active predatory intent. That understanding, and the craft with which it was expressed, is what allowed Wrong Turn to endure in cultural memory long after more technically sophisticated but less emotionally coherent horror films of its era had faded from view. The theatrical release of Wrong Turn on May 30, 2003 represented the culmination of a development and production journey that had begun 2 years earlier, and the distribution arrangements surrounding that release told an important story about how mid-budget genre films were positioned and marketed in early 2000s Hollywood. The film arrived in American cinemas under the banner of 20th Century Fox in partnership with Regency Enterprises, a pairing that gave the production considerably more mainstream visibility and commercial infrastructure than would typically accompany a horror film of its budgetary scale. 20th Century Fox was, in 2003, one of the dominant forces in global film distribution, a major studio with the marketing reach, theatrical relationships, and financial muscle to ensure that a film received genuine nationwide exposure. For a horror film produced through the kind of independent co-production arrangement that had brought Wrong Turn into existence, securing Fox as the American distributor was a significant achievement. It meant wide theatrical release, professional national marketing campaigns, and placement in major multiplex chains across the country rather than the limited platform release that characterized most independent horror of the period. The studio's willingness to take on distribution duties reflected their assessment that the film had genuine commercial potential, that the combination of its genre credentials, its cast, and its production values could attract the mainstream horror audience rather than simply the dedicated genre enthusiast. Regency Enterprises, Fox's partner in the release, was one of the most consistently productive independent production and financing entities operating within the Hollywood system during that era. Founded by Arnon Milchan, Regency had an impressive track record of backing commercially successful films across multiple genres, and their involvement with Wrong Turn was consistent with a portfolio strategy that included genre entertainment alongside more prestige-oriented projects. The Regency brand carried weight in the marketplace and lent the film an additional layer of commercial credibility that reinforced Fox's willingness to invest in its wide release. The release date of May 30, 2003 placed Wrong Turn in the early summer moviegoing season, a positioning decision that carried both opportunities and risks. Summer was traditionally the most commercially fertile period for mainstream entertainment. When school was out, moviegoing habits intensified, and studios deployed their biggest commercial properties to capture the largest possible audience. Placing a mid-budget horror film in this window was a gamble, since it meant competing for audience attention against the major studio tentpole releases that dominated the summer landscape. But it also meant access to the elevated foot traffic and heightened moviegoing energy that summer generated, and for a horror film with genuine commercial appeal, the summer audience represented a significant opportunity. The budget, what $12 million bought. The production budget of $12 million for Wrong Turn was a figure that placed the film in an interesting middle ground within the genre landscape of its moment. It was substantially more than the shoestring budgets on which many celebrated horror films had been made, including some of the very films Wrong Turn was consciously invoking. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre had been produced for approximately $300,000. The Blair Witch Project, which had redefined the commercial possibilities of low-budget horror just 4 years earlier, had famously cost only $60,000. Measured against those benchmarks, $12 million represented genuine luxury. At the same time, $12 million was modest by mainstream Hollywood standards, particularly for a film with the kind of production ambitions that Wrong Turn carried. Stan Winston's creature effects work alone represented a significant portion of that budget, and the extensive location photography in the forests of North Carolina, which stood in for the West Virginia setting of the script, added considerable costs in logistics, crew, and equipment. The cast, while not composed of A-list stars commanding enormous salaries, included several recognizable names whose fees reflected their professional standing. The sum of these demands meant that the production was operating under genuine financial constraints, requiring discipline and creative resourcefulness at every stage. What those $12 million ultimately purchased was a film that looked and felt considerably more expensive than its budget might suggest. This was a testament to the efficiency of the production, the expertise of the crew, and above all to Stan Winston's ability to deliver world-class creature effects within the constraints of an independent budget. The forest photography was genuinely atmospheric and effectively terrifying. The production design of the mountain men's lair was richly detailed and deeply unsettling. The action sequences were choreographed and executed with a craft that matched what major studio productions were achieving at considerably greater expense. This gap between actual budget and perceived production value would prove important to the film's commercial performance. The standard arrangement in American theatrical exhibition during this period gave exhibitors approximately half of the box office gross, meaning that Fox and its partners received roughly $14 million from the domestic and international theatrical run combined. Marketing a wide-release genre film in 2003 typically cost between $15 and $25 million, a figure that could equal or exceed the production budget itself. If Wrong Turn's marketing expenditure fell anywhere near the upper end of that range, the theatrical run alone would not have been sufficient to return the film to profitability on a strict accounting basis. However, the economics of film distribution have never been reducible to theatrical performance alone. The home video and DVD market in 2003 was at the height of its commercial power, generating revenues for successful genre films that often exceeded their theatrical take by substantial margins. Horror films in particular had a strong afterlife in the home video market, where fans who had missed a theatrical run or who wanted to revisit a film they had enjoyed in theaters drove consistent rental and purchase revenue. Wrong Turn, with its genre credentials, its recognizable cast, and the marketing exposure it had received through its Fox distribution, was well positioned to perform strongly in this secondary market. Beyond home video, cable television and pay-per-view rights represented additional revenue streams, as did international broadcast licensing and eventual free-to-air television sales. When all of these downstream revenue sources were factored into the film's commercial calculation, a theatrical gross of $28 million against a $12 million production budget represented a genuinely profitable outcome, even accounting for marketing costs. The film earned back its investment and generated returns sufficient to justify the production of sequels, which duly arrived in subsequent years. The domestic box office trajectory of Wrong Turn also told an interesting story about how the film found its audience. Opening weekend performance was solid rather than spectacular, suggesting that the film attracted a core genre audience immediately but did not generate the kind of breakout mainstream crossover that would have produced blockbuster numbers. What the film demonstrated was legs, a sustained performance over multiple weeks driven by positive word of mouth among horror fans and the slow spread of its reputation through the genre community. This pattern was characteristic of the best mid-budget horror films of the era, which built their commercial cases not through explosive opening weekends but through genuine audience enthusiasm that translated into sustained attendance and eventual strong home video performance. Critical reception, the mixed to negative response and its nature. The critical reception that greeted Wrong Turn upon its release was, by general consensus, mixed to negative, and understanding what that assessment actually meant requires some careful unpacking of both the specific criticisms leveled at the film and the broader context within which professional film criticism engaged with genre horror in 2003. The most consistently voiced criticism of Wrong Turn focused on what reviewers characterized as overdone or derivative writing. This was a substantive critique that identified something real about Alan B. McElroy's screenplay, even if the reviewers who made it sometimes failed to engage with the tradition within which McElroy was consciously working. The charge of derivativeness in a genre horror film is always complicated, because genre filmmaking is by its nature a conversation with precedent. The conventions that critics identified as worn or predictable in Wrong Turn were the same conventions that had made the films it was invoking powerful in the first place. The real question was not whether Wrong Turn used familiar genre architecture but whether it used that architecture with sufficient craft and intelligence to justify its invocation of it, and on that question critics were divided along lines that roughly corresponded to their familiarity with and sympathy for the genre. Critics who came to the film without deep investment in horror genre conventions found its plotting mechanical and its characterization thin. The basic narrative rhythm of survival horror, in which a group is progressively reduced as the antagonists pick off victims one by one until a final confrontation determines the survivors, was legible to these reviewers as simple formula rather than as a sophisticated deployment of established genre mechanics. They were not wrong to identify the formula, but their assessment of it as a failing rather than a feature reflected a critical framework that prioritized novelty and originality above the execution of inherited conventions, a framework that would struggle to account for the lasting power of any genre tradition from tragedy to the western to the musical. The criticism of the writing as overdone also pointed to specific elements of McElroy's script that even sympathetic viewers occasionally found excessive. The backstory of the Mountain Men, the extent of their documented predatory history and the elaborateness of their lair, was detailed enough to risk tipping from suggestive menace into something more like explicit explanation. One of the enduring lessons of effective horror is that what is left unseen and unexplained is almost always more frightening than what is shown and accounted for. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the film Wrong Turn most directly invoked, derived much of its power from a deep refusal to explain or rationalize its antagonists. McElroy's script was somewhat more generous with explanation, and for some viewers this generosity diluted the film's atmosphere of pure inexplicable dread. The genre literacy problem in critical assessment. A substantial portion of Wrong Turn's negative critical reception can be attributed to what might be called a genre literacy problem in professional film criticism. The critical infrastructure for evaluating genre horror in American journalism in 2003 was, with important exceptions, not well developed. Horror had always occupied an uncomfortable position in the critical establishment, simultaneously too popular to ignore and too disreputable to take seriously. The traditions within which a film like Wrong Turn was working, the rural horror and survival horror lineages that stretched back through the 1970s, were not always well understood by critics whose primary frameworks had been developed in relation to more prestige-oriented filmmaking. This meant that critical assessments of Wrong Turn frequently measured the film against the wrong standards. A film that was explicitly attempting to revive and honor the traditions of 1970s genre horror could not be fairly evaluated by critics who regarded those traditions themselves as artistically worthless. The charge that Wrong Turn was derivative was, in many cases, a charge that it resembled the films it was trying to resemble, which was not a failing but an achievement. Similarly, the criticism that the film was simply violent without deeper meaning often reflected a critical unwillingness to engage with the genre's own tradition of using violence as a vehicle for exploring social anxieties, a tradition with genuine intellectual substance that ran from Hitchcock through Romero and Craven. The critics who responded most positively to Wrong Turn tended to be those who brought explicit genre literacy to their assessments, who understood what the film was attempting within its own tradition and evaluated it accordingly. Genre specialist publications and websites gave the film considerably warmer receptions than the mainstream critical establishment, recognizing its craft, its atmospheric effectiveness, and its intelligent engagement with its genre inheritance. This division in critical response was itself revealing, suggesting not that Wrong Turn was a film of divided quality but that it was a film whose qualities were most visible to audiences equipped to perceive them. The audience response, a different verdict. Whatever the professional critical establishment concluded about Wrong Turn, the audience that saw the film in theaters and subsequently on home video rendered a rather different verdict. The film's commercial performance demonstrated genuine popular appeal, but more revealing than the box office numbers was the quality of the audience response as expressed through the emerging online channels of fan criticism and discussion that were, by 2003, beginning to reshape the relationship between genre films and their audiences. On the fan forums, review aggregators, and genre-specific websites where horror enthusiasts gathered to discuss and evaluate new releases, Wrong Turn received a warm and often enthusiastic reception. Audiences responded to its genuine effectiveness as a horror experience, to the craft of its creature design, to the atmospheric tension of its forest sequences, and to the committed performances of its cast. The film worked as horror, which is ultimately the only criterion that matters for a genre film, and audiences who experienced that working recognized it and communicated their recognition through word of mouth that sustained the film's commercial life beyond its opening weekend. This gap between professional critical assessment and audience reception was not unusual for genre horror, but it was particularly pronounced in the case of Wrong Turn, and it illuminated something important about the nature of genre criticism and genre spectatorship. Professional critics evaluated films according to criteria developed primarily in relation to a mainstream of prestige filmmaking that had little direct relationship to the conventions and pleasures of horror. Audiences who came to Wrong Turn as horror fans brought different evaluative frameworks and different expectations, and within those frameworks the film delivered on its promises with considerable skill. The lasting commercial logic of the profitable mid-budget horror film. The commercial profile of Wrong Turn, a modest production budget generating a theatrical gross that more than doubled it while leaving substantial downstream revenue potential, represented a business model that was becoming increasingly attractive to studios and independent producers alike in the early 2000s. The blockbuster mentality that had dominated Hollywood since the late 1970s had produced a system in which studios poured enormous resources into a small number of tentpole productions while the middle ground of mid-budget filmmaking was hollowed out. Genre horror represented one of the few areas where the mid-budget model retained its viability, because horror audiences were reliable, their expectations were clearly defined, and a well-executed genre film could satisfy those expectations without the astronomical marketing and production expenditures that tentpole filmmaking required. Wrong Turn's commercial outcome helped to validate this logic and contributed to a broader renaissance of mid-budget horror in the years immediately following. The film demonstrated that a $12 million horror production, competently executed and professionally distributed, could generate returns sufficient to justify continued investment in the genre at that budget level. This was not a trivial demonstration. It helped to sustain the economic conditions under which a generation of horror filmmakers would work in the mid-2000s, contributing indirectly to the creative flowering of the genre that produced some of its most memorable work in that period. Conclusion: what the numbers and the reviews together reveal. Taken together, the commercial performance and critical reception of Wrong Turn in 2003 paint a portrait of a film that succeeded on its own terms while failing to satisfy standards imposed from outside its own tradition. The $28 million worldwide gross against a $12 million budget was a genuine commercial achievement that justified the creative and financial investments the film's producers had made. The mixed to negative critical response, focused primarily on the perceived derivativeness and formulaic quality of the writing, reflected a critical establishment that lacked the genre literacy to fully engage with what the film was attempting and achieving. What Wrong Turn ultimately demonstrated was that a film could be simultaneously dismissed by a significant portion of the critical establishment and embraced by the audience for which it was made, and that in the economics of genre filmmaking, audience embrace was the more consequential verdict. The film's profitability secured its legacy and its franchise future. Its critical reputation, modest as it was, did not prevent it from finding the audience it deserved and building a lasting place in the horror genre's ongoing conversation with its own history and conventions. You said, explain this key point from Wrong Turn 2003 movie in full expanded form of 3,000 words and do not put references, two college students, Rich Stoker and Hallie S. The opening sequence of Wrong Turn performs one of the most essential functions any horror film can ask of its beginning. It establishes the rules of the world the audience is entering before the main narrative has properly begun. The brief, brutal prologue featuring Rich Stoker and Hallie Smith in the remote West Virginia forest is not simply a conventional horror cold open designed to provide early violence and hook the audience's attention. It is a carefully constructed piece of narrative grammar that teaches the viewer exactly what kind of film they are watching and what the fundamental terms of survival and death within that world are going to be. Rich and Hallie are introduced in media res, already deep into their rock climbing activity on a remote cliff face in the West Virginia wilderness. The choice of rock climbing as their activity is not incidental. It is a pursuit that by its very nature places human beings in a state of absolute physical vulnerability, suspended between earth and sky with nothing but equipment and technique standing between them and a fatal fall. The vertical geography of the cliff creates an immediate and legible visual metaphor for the precariousness of their situation, but it also establishes the specific terms of the danger that is about to claim them. They are not on level ground where flight is possible. They are on a vertical surface where movement is constrained, deliberate, and dependent on cooperation between the two climbers. Rich reaches the top of the cliff first, and in that moment the film makes its most important early statement. He does not pause to survey the landscape or celebrate his achievement. The attack comes immediately, without warning, without any of the conventional horror film signals of mounting dread that an audience might expect. There is no ominous music swell, no extended sequence of Rich sensing that something is wrong before the threat materializes. The violence is sudden, total, and completely without the warning signs that genre convention might have led a viewer to anticipate. This abruptness is deliberate and philosophically significant. It tells the audience that in this world, the normal horror grammar of escalating tension before the strike does not apply. Death can come at any moment, without announcement, without the narrative courtesy of allowing the victim to sense and respond to their danger. The attack on Rich, occurring just out of Hallie's sight, positions her immediately in the film's most terrifying psychological space, the space of not knowing. She can hear the sounds of struggle above her but cannot see what is happening, cannot assess the threat, cannot make informed decisions about how to respond. When something begins pulling the rope that connects her to Rich and the top of the cliff, she faces an impossible interpretive challenge. Is it Rich, injured but still alive and trying to pull her to safety? Is it the thing that killed Rich, using her own lifeline as a weapon against her? The uncertainty is more frightening than certainty would be, because it places Hallie in a situation where any action she takes is potentially wrong. Her decision to cut the rope and fall rather than risk being pulled up to whatever waits at the top is the first survival decision in the film, and it is immediately followed by her first encounter with another of the landscape's hidden weapons, the barbed wire that catches her as she flees through the forest. The image of Hallie caught in the barbed wire, dragged backward into the darkness of the trees despite her desperate resistance, is one of the film's most potent early visual statements. The forest itself seems to be an active participant in her destruction, its hidden dangers operating in concert with the human predators who move through it. She is not simply being hunted by men. She is being reclaimed by a landscape that has been modified and weaponized against intruders. The prologue ends with Hallie's screams fading into the forest, and what follows is silence and the title card. The film has in this brief sequence established its essential emotional proposition: in this place, intelligence and physical capability are not sufficient protections. The landscape itself is hostile, the attackers are invisible and operate without warning, and the mechanisms of entrapment have been laid in advance by a predatory intelligence that understands this terrain with an intimacy that outsiders cannot match. The film's transition from prologue to main narrative is marked by the introduction of Chris Flynn, the medical student whose journey through the West Virginia mountains will anchor the story that follows. Chris's introduction is deliberately and carefully constructed to position him as a figure of competence and purpose operating within the recognizable frameworks of ordinary life, a contrast that makes his subsequent helplessness in the face of what the forest contains all the more disturbing. He is a medical student, a detail that carries significant weight in the film's thematic architecture. Medicine is one of the foundational disciplines of human civilization, the systematic application of accumulated knowledge and technique to the preservation of human life and the alleviation of suffering. A medical student is someone in the process of acquiring the most sophisticated tools humanity has developed for keeping people alive. That the film chooses to make its protagonist a student of medicine rather than, say, a soldier or a survivalist is meaningful. Chris's competence is intellectual and institutional rather than physical and martial. He is good at navigating the systems of modern society, at knowing how to get from one place to another efficiently, at being on time for the professional obligations that structure his life. None of these competencies will serve him in the environment he is about to enter. His reason for driving through the West Virginia mountains, a business meeting, is similarly calibrated to establish his ordinariness and his orientation toward the normal world of schedules and obligations and professional advancement. The business meeting he is trying to reach is a synecdoche for the entire apparatus of contemporary professional life, with its implicit assumptions about the reliable functioning of infrastructure, the availability of accurate information, and the basic safety of movement through the landscape. These assumptions are about to be stripped away one by one. The gas station where Chris stops to ask for directions is a beautifully conceived transitional space, a place that exists at the boundary between the ordinary world and the world the film is about to plunge its characters into. Gas stations in horror films occupy a particular symbolic position as the last outposts of civilization before the wilderness swallows the traveler, and Wrong Turn uses this convention with full awareness of its resonance. The station is physically dilapidated, its surfaces layered with the accumulated grime of neglect, its merchandise outdated and sparse. It is a business that appears to have been largely abandoned by the flows of commerce and connection that sustain ordinary economic life. The proprietor, Maynard, is the film's first human introduction to the world of deliberate obstruction that characterizes the region's relationship with outsiders. His unhelpfulness when Chris asks for directions is ambiguous in its motivation in this early scene, readable either as the simple incuriosity of an old man who knows nothing about the road Chris is asking about, or as something more calculated. This ambiguity is important because it prevents the film from too quickly collapsing the distinction between simple rural isolation and active malice. Not everyone in this world is a predator. But the landscape of helplessness they inhabit, the sense that reliable information and ordinary assistance are not available, applies to both the genuinely ignorant and the deliberately obstructive. The map that Chris finds and uses to plan his alternative route through Bear Mountain Road is another carefully chosen narrative element. Maps represent human attempts to render landscape legible, to impose a grid of knowledge and navigability on the physical world. They are instruments of orientation, tools that promise the traveler that the territory can be known in advance and traversed predictably. The map Chris uses to choose his route through Bear Mountain Road will prove to be a document of false confidence, a tool of orientation that will deliver him directly into a space of total disorientation. The road it marks is real enough, but the reality of what waits along that road is entirely outside the map's representational capacity. The collision and the discovery of the stranded group. The collision that brings Chris into contact with the group of camping students is one of the film's most economically efficient pieces of plotting, managing simultaneously to bring together the film's core group of protagonists, to reveal the first concrete evidence of deliberate human malice in the landscape, and to establish the conditions of shared helplessness that will define the group's subsequent experience. The stopped car that Chris collides with belongs to Jesse, Carly, Scott, Evan, and Francine, 5 college students on a camping trip who represent a social unit very different from Chris's solitary purposeful professional journey. Where Chris is alone and goal-directed, they are a social group, their trip structured around pleasure and companionship rather than obligation. This difference in orientation will matter to how they respond to the crisis they are about to enter, with the social dynamics of an established friendship group adding layers of complexity to the survival decisions that must be made. The immediate physical situation created by the collision is one of concentrated helplessness. Both vehicles are now disabled or stranded, they are deep in a remote mountain road with no cellular service and no easy access to outside assistance, and the practical problem of what to do next must be worked out by a group of people who did not plan to find themselves in this situation together and who have no particular expertise in managing it. The discovery that their tires were punctured by barbed wire rather than damaged through any ordinary road hazard is the film's first definitive revelation of deliberate human agency in the landscape. Up to this point, the dangers the characters face have been attributable to bad luck, poor planning, or the ordinary hazards of remote travel. The barbed wire changes everything. It is not a natural hazard. It is not the result of negligence or accident. It has been intentionally laid across the road by someone who wanted to stop vehicles exactly like theirs, to puncture tires and strand travelers in this particular stretch of forest. The barbed wire is a trap, and the trap has been sprung. This revelation arrives with devastating matter-of-factness. The characters examine the damaged tires, trace the cause back to the barbed wire stretched across the road, and arrive collectively at the understanding that someone put it there on purpose. The film does not bellabore this discovery or score it with musical sting designed to signal its importance. It presents it as a simple fact that must be incorporated into the group's understanding of their situation, and it is all the more frightening for that plainness. The forest is not simply an inhospitable natural environment. It is a managed killing ground, its approach is monitored and its access deliberately obstructed by people who want to control what enters and prevent what enters from leaving. The barbed wire that appears in both the prologue's attack on Hallie and the main narrative's disabling of the stranded car is one of Wrong Turn's most resonant recurring motifs, and its function in the film operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the purely practical level of narrative mechanics, it serves as the mechanism that brings the protagonist and the group together and creates the conditions of helplessness that the rest of the film will exploit. Without the barbed wire trap, Chris would have driven past the stranded car, or the stranded car would not have been there to be collided with, and the entire subsequent story would have been impossible. But the barbed wire does considerably more than this mechanical work. As an image, it carries a complex of cultural and historical associations that enrich its horror function significantly. Barbed wire is fundamentally an instrument of boundary enforcement and containment, a technology developed specifically to mark territory and prevent movement across it. Its association with the most catastrophic episodes of 20th century history, with the prison camps and killing fields where it was deployed as an instrument of mass confinement, gives it a historical weight that horror cinema has drawn on repeatedly and effectively. In the context of Wrong Turn, the barbed wire marks the boundary between the ordinary world and the predator's killing ground, between the space of normal movement and the space of lethal entrapment. The fact that it has been deliberately laid by the mountain men to stop and strand travelers makes it a statement about sovereignty, a territorial marking that communicates to anyone who encounters it, though not in time to be useful, that this space is controlled and that the controllers do not welcome intrusion. It is a primitive but effective security system, adapted to the specific geography of the forest road and calibrated to create exactly the situation it creates: disabled vehicles, stranded travelers, and no obvious means of seeking outside help. The image of Hallie caught in the barbed wire at the end of the prologue and the discovery of barbed wire across the road in the main narrative together establish the wire as one of the film's primary symbols of the predator's relationship to their territory. They do not simply wait in their lair for prey to wander close enough to be taken. They actively manage the approaches to their territory, laying traps and barriers that funnel movement, create helplessness, and bring potential victims to them on their own terms. This is the behavior not of simple animals but of strategic intelligences, beings who understand their environment thoroughly and exploit that understanding with frightening effectiveness. The group dynamics and their narrative implications. The 5 camping students who join Chris after the collision are differentiated with sufficient clarity to function as individual characters while also representing the social dynamics of a friendship group under stress. Jessie emerges quickly as the most practically capable and emotionally level-headed of the group, her response to the crisis distinguished by a quality of steadiness and pragmatic focus that marks her as the character most likely to survive. Carly and Scott function as a couple whose relationship adds emotional stakes to the survival situation, since threats to one are threats to both in a way that compounds the psychological intensity of their predicament. Evan and Francine are less immediately characterized but no less present as human beings whose lives will matter to the narrative. What the group collectively represents is the social world of ordinary young American life, its pleasures and its frictions and its assumptions about safety and the basic benevolence of the environment. They went into the West Virginia mountains to enjoy nature, to camp and hike and spend time together away from the pressures of their ordinary lives. The wilderness was supposed to be recreational. The discovery that it is instead a killing ground requires a fundamental reorientation of every assumption they brought to the trip, and that reorientation, painful and terrifying, is one of the film's central psychological subjects. The addition of Chris to this group creates an interesting dynamic, since he is at once an outsider to their social unit and the person most responsible for their current situation through the collision. He comes to them already under a burden of partial responsibility, and the group's acceptance of him as a fellow victim rather than a cause of their problems is one of the small social negotiations that the film handles with considerable subtlety. In a situation of extreme stress, the question of who is to blame for what tends to become more rather than less important, and the fact that the group manages to move past the immediate shock of the collision and orient collectively toward their shared predicament is itself a small narrative achievement. West Virginia as a space of deliberate horror. The choice to set Wrong Turn in the mountains and forests of West Virginia was not simply a matter of finding convenient locations for shooting or exploiting regional tax incentives. West Virginia as a setting carried a specific set of cultural associations that were integral to the film's horror strategy, and the way the film deploys those associations merits careful attention. West Virginia occupies a distinctive place in American cultural mythology. It is a state shaped by geography, its rugged mountainous terrain making large-scale agriculture difficult and concentrating economic life around extractive industries like coal mining that have historically created cycles of boom and bust, prosperity and abandonment. Its population, particularly in its more remote regions, has historically been among the poorest in the country, and the cultural distance between its most isolated communities and the mainstream of American life has been the subject of stereotyping, condescension, and genuine fascination in roughly equal measure. The particular stereotype that Wrong Turn most directly exploits is the image of the isolated Appalachian community as a space where the normal processes of social regulation have broken down, where generations of inbreeding and poverty have produced human beings who exist outside the moral frameworks of mainstream American civilization. This image is deeply problematic in many respects, rooted in class prejudice and cultural condescension toward a region and a people who have been subjected to systematic economic exploitation throughout their history. But it is also genuinely powerful as a source of horror imagery, tapping into anxieties that run very deep in the American cultural unconscious about what lies beyond the reach of civilization's civilizing influence. By setting Wrong Turn in West Virginia, McElroy and Schmidt placed their film squarely within the tradition of rural horror that had found its definitive expression in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Deliverance, films that similarly used the geography and cultural associations of specific American regions to amplify their horror effects. The mountains and forests of West Virginia in Wrong Turn are not just a backdrop. They are an active element of the horror, a space with its own rules and its own predatory logic that the outsiders who wander into them are entirely unequipped to navigate. The significance of the opening as a complete statement. What makes the opening sequences of Wrong Turn so effective as horror filmmaking is the completeness with which they establish the film's world and its rules. By the time the barbed wire is discovered and the stranded group understands that someone put it there deliberately, the audience has been given everything they need to understand the fundamental terms of what is to follow. The prologue has established that the predators operate without warning and without mercy, that the landscape has been weaponized against intruders, and that the normal horror grammar of escalating tension before the kill does not apply. The introduction of Chris has established the normal world's inadequacy in the face of what this landscape contains, the failure of maps and gas stations and professional purpose to provide reliable orientation. The collision and the discovery of the barbed wire have established that the danger is not accidental or natural but deliberate and managed, the work of intelligences that understand this territory and use it against those who do not. Together, these elements create a complete opening statement of Wrong Turn's horror proposition. You are in a place that wants to kill you, managed by beings who know it far better than you do, and all the tools and assumptions and social resources you carry from your ordinary life are not only useless here but actively misleading, because they were built for a world whose rules do not apply. That proposition, established with economy and genuine craft in the film's opening minutes, is what the rest of Wrong Turn will spend its running time exploring and exploiting with escalating ferocity. Evan and Francine, the horror of separation and the first deaths. The decision to leave Evan and Francine behind to watch the cars while the others go in search of help is one of those narrative choices that horror films require their characters to make, choices that seem entirely reasonable within the logic of the situation but that the audience, already conditioned by genre convention and by the film's opening prologue, understands immediately to be fatal. The separation of the group is a classical horror mechanism, but Wrong Turn earns its deployment of this convention by grounding it in the entirely sensible practical reasoning that someone needs to stay with the vehicles. There is nothing stupid or careless about the decision. It is the kind of decision any reasonable group of stranded travelers might make. That it leads directly to death is a statement about the nature of the environment rather than a judgment on the characters who make it. Evan and Francine left alone together establish a brief interlude of relative normalcy that makes what follows more rather than less disturbing. They are a couple, their relationship defined by the easy intimacy of people who know each other well, and their interaction in the moments before the attack carries the texture of ordinary life, ordinary conversation, ordinary human connection. This texture is important because it gives the audience something specific and valuable to lose. The horror of Evan's disappearance is not simply the horror of a death but the horror of the sudden and violent erasure of that ordinary human warmth. Evan's disappearance is handled with a restraint that amplifies its terror. He hears something from the woods, the perennial horror film signal of impending danger, and goes to investigate with the casual curiosity of someone who has not yet fully absorbed the lesson that this landscape teaches. The woods take him without drama, without the extended chase or the prolonged struggle that might give the death a sense of proportional narrative weight. He simply goes into the trees and does not come back, absorbed by the forest as completely and silently as if the ground had opened beneath him. Francine's discovery of Evan's ear on the ground is one of the film's most viscerally effective horror moments, precisely because of its synecdochal quality. The ear is not a conventionally spectacular piece of horror imagery in the way that a mutilated body or a graphic death scene might be. It is a small, specific, horribly recognizable fragment of a person, and its presence on the ground tells Francine, and the audience, everything that needs to be known about what has happened to Evan without showing any of it directly. The imagination, given this single specific detail, fills in the rest with a thoroughness and a personalness that no explicit imagery could match. Francine's own death follows with the same brutal economy that has characterized the film's approach to violence from the prologue forward. The barbed wire that strangles her connects her death visually and symbolically to the trap that disabled the cars and to the wire that caught Hallie in the opening sequence, reinforcing the film's presentation of barbed wire as the predator's signature instrument, the medium through which they express their territorial control. Her death is not shown in full, consistent with the film's strategic use of implication and suggestion alongside its more explicit moments, but its aftermath, the dragged corpse, the absence where a person was, is fully present in the narrative. The discovery and entry into the isolated cabin by the remaining members of the group marks the film's transition from outdoor pursuit horror to a more claustrophobic and psychologically intense register. The cabin is the predator's home, the physical center of their existence, and its contents are a comprehensive and horrifying index of what they are and how they live. Entering it without knowing its nature, the group is making a reasonable survival decision, seeking shelter and possibly communication equipment in a structure that represents human habitation and therefore the possibility of help. That the structure is human habitation of the most terrifying kind is something they discover only after they are inside. The interior of the cabin is one of the film's great set design achievements, a space whose every detail contributes to the portrait of lives lived entirely outside the boundaries of civilization and its moral frameworks. Stan Winston's production work extended beyond the creature design of the mountain men themselves to inform the physical environment they inhabit, and the result is a space that feels authentic in its horror rather than artificially composed. The human body parts that the group discovers are not simply shock imagery deployed for visceral effect. They are evidence of a way of life, remnants of the predator's dietary practices and their complete indifference to the human status of their victims. The victims in the cabin were not killed in sudden violence and left behind. They were brought here, processed, and consumed, and the remains that testify to this process have been accumulated over time, suggesting a pattern of predation that long predates the current group's arrival in the forest. The horror of what the group finds in the cabin operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the immediate visceral level, the imagery of human remains is designed to produce the primal physical revulsion that is horror cinema's most basic tool. But on a deeper level, the cabin's contents are horrifying because of what they imply about the predator's consciousness. The mountain men have not hidden their practices or shown any sign of shame about them. The remains are simply present in the domestic space, alongside the other artifacts of ordinary habitation, with no apparent distinction made between them and other household items. This equivalence is perhaps the most disturbing quality of the space, the evidence that for the cabin's inhabitants, other human beings are simply a resource category, no different in moral status from any other food source. The group's horror at what they find is rendered with psychological realism. Their reactions are not the cartoon screaming of lesser horror films but the genuine shock and disorientation of people confronting something that fundamentally violates their understanding of the world. They must simultaneously process the horror of what they are seeing and make rapid practical decisions about what to do next, and the tension between these two demands, between the need to feel and the need to act, creates a psychological pressure that the film handles with considerable sophistication. The return of the mountain men, Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye. The return of the mountain men to their cabin while the group is still inside marks the film's most sustained and complex horror sequence, a long section of hide-and-seek tension that exploits the geometry of the cabin space with genuine craft. The three cannibals, Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye, arrive carrying Francine's corpse, and in doing so they bring the outside horror inside, collapsing the boundary between the space of pursuit and the space of hiding. The mountain men are here revealed in their fullness for the first time, and the physical reality that Stan Winston's effects team has created for them is strikingly effective. Their deformities are immediately legible as the product of the generations of inbreeding that the film's backstory posits, their features distorted in ways that retain enough human quality to make them recognizable as persons while simultaneously communicating their profound otherness. They are not monsters in the sense of being superhuman or supernatural. They are human beings who have become something that human society cannot recognize as human, their deviation from the norm comprehensive enough that the ordinary frameworks of empathy and social recognition simply do not apply to them. The names assigned to the three mountain men, Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye, are themselves a piece of significant characterization. They are not given names in the ordinary sense of names, not the kind of names that carry family histories and personal identities and social relationships. They are identified by their physical deformities, by the most visible markers of their deviation from human norms. This naming convention, or rather anti-naming convention, strips them of the kind of individual identity that would make them psychologically legible in conventional human terms. They are defined entirely by what is wrong with them, by the ways in which their bodies have departed from the human standard, and this definitional strategy places them outside the normal categories of personhood. Their behavior in the cabin, dismembering and eating Francine's body with the casual efficiency of a routine domestic activity, is simultaneously the film's most disturbing extended sequence and one of its most important thematic statements. The mountain men are not excited by what they are doing. They are not performing violence for the pleasure of performance. They are processing a food resource with the practical focus of beings for whom this activity is simply a part of ordinary life. This mundanity, the complete absence of the heightened emotional state that should accompany these actions in any framework of normal human psychology, is more frightening than any amount of theatrical villainy would be. It communicates that the gap between them and their victims is not primarily a matter of intention or morality but of category. They do not regard the group hiding in their cabin as fellow beings toward whom they have moral obligations. They regard them as future meals. The aftermath of watching, psychological damage and practical necessity. The group's experience of watching the mountain men from hiding is one of the film's most psychologically intense passages, a sustained confrontation with absolute helplessness in the face of atrocity. They cannot intervene to stop what is happening to Francine's body. They cannot make noise or movement without revealing themselves and inviting immediate death. They can only watch and endure the watching, and the endurance required is of a kind that leaves permanent marks on those who survive it. The film handles this sequence with a degree of restraint that is actually more effective than explicit imagery would be. We see the reactions of the hiding group more than we see the details of what the mountain men are doing, and this choice reflects a sophisticated understanding of horror's psychology. The faces of people watching something terrible communicate the terror of what is being watched with a directness and an intimacy that explicit imagery cannot match, because faces engage our empathy in ways that gore does not. We read the expressions of the hidden group and our imaginations do the work that explicit images would have done less effectively. The decision that must be made after the mountain men fall asleep is another of the film's extended exercises in tension. The group must move through the cabin and out into the forest without waking their hosts, and the obstacles to this movement, the creaking floorboards, the positioned bodies of the sleeping cannibals, the general geography of a space they do not know well in darkness, create a sequence of escalating near-discoveries that keeps the audience in a state of sustained physical tension. When the inevitable discovery comes and the mountain men wake and give chase, it is almost a relief, a release from the unbearable pressure of near silence and near stillness, even though it initiates a new and more immediate kind of danger. The graveyard of cars and the shape of what has come before. The group's discovery of previous victims' cars in the forest is one of Wrong Turn's most quietly devastating moments, a revelation that contextualizes the horror the group is experiencing within a much larger and longer history of predation. The cars are not fresh, not recently abandoned. They are in various states of age and decay, suggesting that the mountain men have been hunting travelers in this forest for years, possibly for generations. The group is not facing an isolated or unusual event. They are the latest in a long series of victims, and the forest contains the accumulated evidence of every previous hunt. This discovery serves multiple narrative functions. It provides the group with potential resources, the possibility of finding a working vehicle or useful equipment among the abandoned cars. But more importantly, it communicates the scope and the duration of the predatory activity in the forest in a way that makes the threat feel systematic rather than accidental. The mountain men are not opportunistic predators who happened upon a group of stranded travelers. They are professional hunters who have been managing this territory for a long time, who have developed their techniques through extensive practice, and whose understanding of how to hunt in this specific environment is comprehensive and battle-tested. The attempt to use the cars as a basis for an escape plan forces the group to think tactically about their situation, to move from pure reactive flight to something like strategic agency. Chris's decision to draw the cannibals' attention by getting himself shot in the leg in order to allow the others to reach a truck is the first of the film's significant self-sacrificial gestures, a willingness to absorb personal harm in service of the group's survival. The fact that the truck they reach contains Evan's body is a reminder that the environment they are navigating remains saturated with the evidence of what they are fleeing. Safety and horror exist in the same spaces, and the momentary refuge of the truck is immediately complicated by the presence of death within it. Scott's death and the economics of sacrifice. Scott's decision to create a diversion so that Jesse, Carly, and Chris can escape is the film's most explicitly heroic moment, and its outcome, Scott's death by arrows from the pursuing mountain men, is handled with a brutality that refuses to sentimentalize sacrifice. In a lesser film, a character's willing self-sacrifice might be rewarded with survival, the heroic gesture producing a heroic outcome. Wrong Turn does not deal in these comfortable moral economies. Scott sacrifices himself and dies for it, and the deaths of the others continue regardless. His gesture buys time and the survival of 3 members of the group, but it does not change the fundamental terms of the pursuit or diminish the threat that pursues them. The arrows that kill Scott are a significant detail in the film's characterization of the mountain men's hunting practices. Archery requires skill, practice, and patient development of technique, and the effectiveness with which the mountain men deploy it confirms that they are not simply savage and undisciplined. They are practiced hunters who have developed their skills over time and who bring genuine competence to the pursuit of their prey. The arrows are another element in the portrait of a predatory intelligence that is not to be underestimated or dismissed as merely animal. The watchtower, a moment of possible salvation. The watchtower that Jesse, Carly, and Chris stumble upon represents the film's most sustained engagement with the theme of communication and the possibility of outside help. The old radio in the tower is a technology of connection, an instrument designed to bridge the isolation of the forest and bring remote locations into contact with the wider world and its resources. For the group, finding and activating it represents not just a practical rescue strategy but a psychological lifeline, the first genuine possibility since the beginning of their ordeal that the nightmare might be ended by the intervention of outside agency rather than fought through on their own. The sequence in which they use the radio to call for help is charged with the tension of impending exposure. The radio will make noise. Noise will attract the mountain men. But not using the radio means remaining in the forest with no chance of rescue. The decision to use it despite the risk is entirely rational, but its consequences are immediate and catastrophic. The mountain men, already searching the forest, are directed to the tower by the radio's response to the group's call, and the moment of potential salvation becomes the occasion for the next phase of the assault. The attacker's inability to gain entry to the tower, a brief period of structural protection for the group, is followed by their decision to set it on fire, a response that is both practically effective and symbolically resonant. Fire is the ultimate territorial assertion. The forced jump from the burning watchtower into the surrounding trees initiates the film's final extended chase sequence, a sustained passage of physical horror that moves through the forest canopy with genuine kineticism. The tree-to-tree pursuit exploits the vertical dimension of the forest in a way that recalls the cliff climbing of the prologue, again placing the characters in a spatial environment where movement is constrained and the conventional advantages of speed and agility that might favor prey over predator are significantly reduced. Carly's half-decapitation by Three Fingers axe is the film's most extreme single act of violence against a named character, and its extremity serves a specific narrative function. It occurs in the context of what appeared to be a successful escape, the group managing to put distance between themselves and the pursuers, the possibility of survival seeming briefly real. Carly's death shatters this possibility with a violence that is calibrated precisely to the hope it destroys. The more hope a moment of relative safety generates, the more devastating the violence that terminates it. Three Fingers' subsequent fall from the treetops at Chris's hands is the film's first successful act of physical resistance against the mountain men, and its significance lies precisely in its incompleteness. One cannibal has been removed from the pursuit, but the others remain, and the forest remains what it has always been. Chris's act of resistance is real and meaningful, but it does not constitute a turn in the narrative toward safety. It is a moment of agency in a situation that continues to be defined by profound vulnerability. The waterfall cave, a temporary refuge in an unfinished world. The cave behind the waterfall where Jesse and Chris take refuge at the close of this long sequence of escalating horror is both a literal and a symbolic space. Literally, it provides temporary concealment, the sound and visual obscuration of the falling water creating a barrier between them and the pursuing cannibals. Symbolically, it is a liminal space, neither the full exposure of the forest nor the comparative solidity of the tower, a threshold point between the horror they have survived and the horror that remains to be faced. That the film leaves them there, breathing and alive but not yet safe, captures the essential emotional truth of their situation. They have survived a sequence of events that killed 3 of their companions. They have resisted and in one case successfully fought back against their pursuers. But the mountain men are not defeated, the forest is not neutralized, and the conditions that made this nightmare possible remain entirely in place. The waterfall cave is a pause, not an ending, a moment of suspended breath in a story that has not yet resolved itself. It is the horror film's version of the eye of the storm, a temporary stillness that exists within rather than beyond the violence, and whose temporary quality makes it as tense in its way as any of the more explicit horror that has preceded it. You said, explain this key point from Wrong Turn 2003 movie in full expanded form of 3,000 words and do not put references. In the morning, the cannibals find them, pushy. The sequence opens in the harsh, unforgiving light of morning. For the characters, surviving the night was supposed to be the hardest hurdle, but daylight offers no sanctuary in the West Virginia backcountry. At this point in the film, the group of friends has been relentlessly hunted and whittled down by 3 inbred, cannibalistic mountain men, 3 Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye. The remaining survivors, Chris Flynn, a medical student accidentally trapped in this nightmare due to a traffic jam on the main highway, and Jesse Burlingame, are exhausted, traumatized, and running on pure adrenaline. The ambush. The cannibals, who possess an intimate, lifelong knowledge of the terrain, easily track the pair to their temporary hiding spot. The horror of this morning ambush lies in its suddenness. The woods, which briefly felt quiet, instantly become a trap. When the cannibals strike, their objective is clear: eliminate the male threat and capture the female. The pushing of Chris. During the chaotic struggle, Chris is brutally overpowered and shoved down a steep, rocky hill. In survival horror, hills, cliffs, and ravines act as physical boundaries that isolate characters. By tumbling down the incline, Chris is visually and physically separated from Jesse. The fall is violent. He crashes through brush, rocks, and dirt, rendering him temporarily incapacitated and presumed dead or entirely neutralized by his attackers. The abduction of Jesse. With Chris out of commission, Jesse is completely vulnerable. The cannibals do not kill her on the spot. Throughout the film, it is established that they bring their victims back to their lair, a dilapidated cabin filled with the macabre trophies of their past hunts, either to butcher them fresh or to subject them to prolonged terror. Jesse is taken hostage, dragging the narrative into its final act, a rescue mission. To Chris, the sight of a uniform and a law enforcement vehicle represents an immediate end to the nightmare. It means communication with the outside world, firearms, and professional protection. However, the film swiftly subverts this hope to maximize the audience's sense of dread. The police officer is completely out of his depth. He is an outsider operating under standard rules of law and order, completely unaware that he has stepped into a sovereign territory ruled by lawless, predatory monsters. The sudden execution. Before the officer can fully comprehend Chris's panicked warnings or assess the situation, a gunshot rings out through the trees. Sawtooth, utilizing his skills as a hunter, sniper, and woodsman, shoots the officer dead on the spot. The execution is swift and unceremonious. Thematic meaning. The instant death of the cop serves a narrative purpose. It signals to Chris and the audience that society is not coming to save them. The badge holds no power here. The firearm, which should have been a tool of salvation, is now just another weapon to be claimed by the killers. Witnessing the horrific ease with which the officer was killed, Chris realizes that his only chance of survival is absolute stealth. He cannot outrun a bullet, and he cannot fight Sawtooth in an open field. He melts back into the dense foliage, suppressing his breathing and his terror, watching from the shadows as the power dynamic completely flips. 3. The MacGyver infiltration, hiding under the truck. With the officer dead, the cannibals begin utilizing the tools of civilized society against their victims. Sawtooth approaches the corpse, completely unfazed by the act of killing a representative of the law. He rifles through the dead man's pockets, retrieves the keys to the police truck, and claims the vehicle. The symbolic appropriation of the truck. Driving the police truck back to the cabin is a highly symbolic action. The vehicle, meant to bring justice and rescue, is transformed into a chariot for a cannibalistic killer. It also provides the monsters with a massive mechanical advantage, speed and a heavy steel frame. Chris's desperate choice. This moment defines Chris's character arc. Up to this point, he has been a victim of circumstance, trying to escape. Now, with Jesse captured, he makes a conscious decision to go back into the jaws of death. He knows that if he tries to walk out of the mountains alone, he might survive, but Jesse will face an unspeakable, agonizing death. The under-vehicle sneak. As Sawtooth prepares to drive away, Chris executes a classic, high-risk stealth maneuver. He sneaks out of the brush, positions himself beneath the heavy police truck, and grips the undercarriage. Physical toll. This is a grueling feat of strength. He must hold on for dear life while suspended inches above a bumpy, unpaved mountain road, enduring the heat of the exhaust, flying gravel, and the violent jolting of the vehicle. Narrative function. This choice mirrors his internal transformation. He is literally riding the belly of the beast to infiltrate the killer's home ground, using their own transport as a Trojan horse. 4. The horrors of the cabin and the desecration of the cop. The scene shifts back to the focal point of evil in the film, the cannibal's cabin. The interior of the cabin is designed to look like a grotesque parody of a traditional American home, decorated with preserved human body parts, rusted tools, and the stolen belongings of dozens of missing travelers. Sawtooth arrives with the dead officer, and the cannibals immediately treat the corpse like livestock brought home from a successful hunt. In front of a horrified, screaming Jesse, they casually chop off the officer's head. This scene is crucial for establishing the psychological state of the villains. They do not view human beings as people, they view them strictly as meat. The act is not performed with theatrical malice or anger, it is done with the mundane, routine casualness of a butcher processing cattle. The desecration of the officer's body reinforces the absolute finality of their isolation. The laws of the outside world have been entirely severed, symbolized by the severed head of the lawman. 5. The fiery reclamation, the counterattack. Just as Jess's situation reaches its absolute nadir, Chris launches his rescue plan. He does not simply sneak into the cabin, He uses the elements of surprise, vehicular violence, and fire to level the playing field against foes who are physically vastly superior to him. Setting the cabin on fire. Chris recognizes that the cabin itself is a source of strength for the cannibals. It contains their weapons, their shelter, and their familiar environment. By setting it on fire, he immediately creates chaos, forces them into a panic, disrupts their coordination, and cuts off their vision with thick smoke. Driving the truck into the house. In a spectacular display of action movie resourcefulness, Chris takes the wheel of the police truck and rams it directly through the walls of the cabin. This sudden, violent intrusion shatters the structural integrity of the building and physically stuns the cannibals. It acts as a literal breakthrough, crashing through the barriers of their horrifying domain to reach Jesse. The rescue. Amidst the splintering wood, shattered glass, and rising flames, Chris moves quickly to cut Jesse free from her bonds. The rescue requires precise timing. The cabin is rapidly becoming an inferno, and the cannibals, resilient and enraged by the destruction of their home, are quick to recover, realizing that they cannot simply outrun these apex predators on foot or in a slow-moving vehicle without being hunted down again. Chris decides to completely erase the threat. He spots a large fuel tank adjacent to the cabin. Drawing a firearm, likely retrieved from the police truck or officer, Chris takes aim and fires directly into the highly volatile tank. The explosion. The bullet sparks a catastrophic chemical reaction, causing a massive explosion that completely engulfs the cabin and the cannibals inside. The blast serves multiple narrative and cinematic purposes. The ultimate climax, it provides a visually spectacular, explosive punctuation mark to the relentless tension of the film. Catharsis, for the audience and the characters, the destruction of the cabin by fire represents a purification, burning away the den of horrors and seemingly destroying the monsters within it. The standard slasher ending, in horror tradition, exploding the killer's lair is the ultimate statement of definitive victory, or so it seems. With the cabin reduced to a smoking crater of ash and debris, Chris and Jesse claim the cannibals' own pickup truck, a vehicle originally used to hunt down victims, and use it to flee the area. They drive down the winding mountain roads, away from the heart of darkness. Stopping at Maynard's gas station. During their drive back to civilization, Chris pulls over at the dilapidated gas station owned by Maynard, an old, creepy man seen earlier in the film. It is heavily implied throughout the movie that Maynard acts as a lookout or accomplice for the cannibals, intentionally misdirecting tourists down the wrong turn road to ensure a steady supply of victims for his monstrous extended family. Character role in the narrative ecosystem. Fate action in climax. Chris and Jesse the final survivors escape via the killer's truck. The cannibals, the apex predators, seemingly incinerated in the cabin. Blast Maynard, the enabler gas station owner, left alive but stripped of his misdirection tool, ripping off the map. Chris walks into the station or up to the outdoor display, finds the deceptive road map that guides unsuspecting travelers into the cannibals' hunting grounds, and violently rips it off the wall. This simple act is rich with psychological and narrative meaning. Prevention. Chris is actively destroying the trap so that no future travelers will fall into the same nightmare he did. Reclaiming agency. By tearing down the map, Chris asserts control over the geography that had previously imprisoned and terrified him. Closure. It represents a refusal to let the cycle of violence continue uninterrupted, signaling a definitive exit from the nightmare. 8. The mid-credits twist, the horror unkillable. Just as the audience relaxes, believing Chris and Jesse have achieved a clean, definitive victory, Wrong Turn deploys one of the oldest and most effective tropes in the slasher handbook, the post-climax survival twist. The arrival of the deputy sheriff. The mid-credit scene cuts back to the smoldering, blackened ruins of the exploded cabin. A lone deputy sheriff, dispatched to investigate the chaotic radio calls and the disappearance of the first officer, arrives on the scene. The presence of this new deputy underscores the tragic irony of timing in horror movies. Help has finally arrived, but it is far too late to save anyone, and the new protector is completely unaware of the danger. With shocking speed, Three Finger ambushes the unsuspecting deputy, killing him instantly. As the screen cuts away, the ambient sound design fills with his signature, high-pitched, maniacal laughter. This final image serves a definitive genre purpose. The threat endures, it shatters the absolute closure of the explosion, proving that the evil has not been purged from the mountains. Setting up sequels, it leaves the door wide open for future installments, which eventually manifested as a massive multifilm franchise, ensuring that The Wrong Turn remains a permanent, lethal hazard on the American map. The classic stinger, it sends the audience out of the theater with a final jolt of adrenaline, reminding them that in true survival horror, the monster is rarely truly dead. The cast of the 2003 survival horror film Wrong Turn, directed by Rob Schmidt and written by Alan B. McElroy, serves as a quintessential masterclass in slasher film archetypes, character dynamics, and physical typecasting. Released during a transitional era for the horror genre, sandwiched between the self-referential, meta-slasher boom of the late 1990s initiated by Scream and the gritty, visceral, torture porn wave of the mid-2000s heralded by Saw and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, Wrong Turn succeeded largely due to the distinct flavor brought by its ensemble cast. The performers do not merely play generic victims and monsters. Instead, they embody a carefully constructed ecosystem of urban outsiders clashing against isolated, primordial American nightmares. By exploring each member of this cast in exhaustive detail, we can unpack how their specific performances, physical presences, and character trajectories formulate the narrative machinery of this cult classic horror film. 1. Desmond Harrington as Chris Flynn, the reluctant hero. At the center of the film's narrative matrix is Desmond Harrington, portraying Chris Flynn, a clean-cut, professional medical student traveling through the West Virginia mountains on his way to a high-stakes job interview. Harrington's performance is pivotal because he provides the audience with a stabilizing, logical anchor point in a world that rapidly descends into chaotic irrationality. The professional outsider. Chris Flynn represents the upper-middle-class urban professional who treats the rural landscape merely as an inconvenience to be bypassed. Harrington plays Chris with a sharp, driven energy at the film's open. He is dressed in a crisp white shirt, constantly checking his watch, and operating on a strict schedule. This visual and behavioral setup is critical. His primary motivation is a clock-bound corporate or medical deadline, making his sudden trapping in a timeless wilderness all the more jarring. The catalyst of the plot. Harrington's character is directly responsible for merging the two separate groups of victims. Frustrated by a massive traffic jam caused by a chemical spill on the main highway, Chris takes an unmapped dirt road, distracted by a fallen piece of trash, and slams his vehicle directly into the stationary SUV of the other travelers. Harrington beautifully balances the immediate guilt, frustration, and pragmatism of this moment. He does not play Chris as an unlikable jerk, rather, he is a stressed individual trying to manage a logistical disaster. Physicality and evolution into the final male. As the narrative progresses and the cannibalistic threat becomes clear, Harrington shifts his performance from frantic panic to cold, calculated survivalism. His background as a medical student is woven seamlessly into his physical choices. When he is wounded in the leg by a gunshot, Harrington conveys the agonizing pain but also the clinical understanding of how to manage the injury. He transitions from a passive victim trying to escape into an active combatant who uses stealth, resourcefulness, and vehicular violence to rescue Jesse. Harrington's performance establishes Chris Flynn as one of the more competent, intelligent male protagonists in 2000s horror cinema. 2. Eliza Dushku as Jessie Burlingame, the resilient survivor. By 2003, Eliza Dushku was already a household name among genre fans due to her iconic, career-defining role as the rogue vampire slayer Faith in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. Casting Dushku as Jessie Burlingame was a deliberate subversion of the traditional, frail horror movie damsel. Dushku brings an inherent toughness, athletic physicality, and fierce independence to the screen. The emotional weight of the group. When the audience first meets Jessie, she is already carrying a heavy emotional burden. She has recently broken up with her boyfriend, an event that casts a somber shadow over what was supposed to be a therapeutic camping trip with her friends. Dushku plays Jessie not as a weeping victim of heartbreak, but as a guarded, slightly weary woman trying to find her footing. Her natural screen presence immediately positions her as the true leader of the camping group. The action-oriented final girl. Dushku's background in stunt-heavy television roles is fully utilized in Wrong Turn. Jessie is physically active throughout the hunt, scaling massive trees, sprinting through dense undergrowth, and navigating high cliffs. Dushku avoids the classic horror trope of the screaming woman who constantly trips over invisible roots. Even when captured and tied to a bedframe in the cannibals' cabin, her terror is laced with fury and defiance. The chemistry between Eliza Dushku and Desmond Harrington is grounded in mutual survival rather than forced romance. As the last two survivors standing, their interactions feel earned. Dushku allows Jessie to show moments of profound vulnerability, such as mourning her dead friends, while instantly snapping back into defensive positioning when danger nears. Her portrayal ensures that Jessie is remembered as a powerhouse final girl who survives through sheer grit. 3. Emmanuelle Chriqui as Carly, the fragile standard. Emmanuelle Chriqui plays Carly, Jess's close friend and the woman caught in the middle of a looming lifelong commitment to her fiancé, Scott. Chriqui, known for her soft, striking beauty and accessible charm, provides a stark contrast to Dushku's hard-edged demeanor. Carly represents the more traditional, vulnerable slasher victim, someone whose anxieties are rooted in domesticity rather than survival. The nervous archetype. Tricky infuses Carly with a palpable, escalating sense of anxiety from her very first scene. She is the character most overtly disturbed by their isolation, the absence of cell phone service, and the general creepiness of the woods. This performance style is crucial for building suspense. While Chris and Jesse analyze their situation logically, Carly's raw, unfiltered panic alerts the audience to the terrifying reality of their vulnerability. The tragedy of the decapitation. Carly's character arc culminates in one of the most shocking and visually striking death scenes in the film. While attempting to escape through the canopy of the trees, Carly is ambushed. Tricky's performance during this sequence captures the absolute terror of a domestic city dweller facing an unnatural predator. Her sudden, brutal decapitation via an axe through the watchtower floor serves as a major narrative pivot, signaling that the film is willing to kill off major, sympathetic characters with merciless efficiency. 4. Jeremy Sisto as Scott, the protective victim. Jeremy Sisto plays Scott, Carly's fiancé. Sisto, an actor possessing immense dramatic range, plays Scott as a fundamentally decent, well-meaning young man who is trying his best to be a protective, masculine figure for his future wife, despite being completely out of his element in the wilderness. The burden of responsibility. Sisto injects Scott with a subtle layer of stress. He feels responsible for the safety of Carly and their friends, and he carries an unspoken guilt about their predicament. When Chris crashes into their SUV, Sisto's initial reaction is defensive and angry, a natural response for a man trying to protect his tribe. However, he quickly pivots to cooperation, showing that Scott is reasonable and cooperative. Sacrifice as character redemption. Scott's demise is one of the more heroic moments among the supporting cast. Recognizing that the cannibals are closing in on Carly, Jesse, and Chris, Scott intentionally draws the killer's attention to himself, sprinting through an open clearing to buy the others time to reach the safety of a truck. Sisto's performance during his final moments is a mix of terror and resolute determination. He is struck down by multiple arrows shot by the cannibals, a death that highlights the predatory, archery-driven hunting style of the mountain men. 5. Kevin Zegers as Evan and Lindy Booth as Francine, the early sacrifices. To establish the stakes of a survival horror film, the narrative must sacrifice characters early on to demonstrate the lethality of the environment. Kevin Zegers and Lindy Booth play Evan and Francine, the couple who remain behind at the disabled SUV while the others hike out to look for help. Kevin Zegers as Evan. Zegers plays Evan as the classic, laid-back stoner archetype of the early 2000s. He is relaxed, heavily reliant on marijuana to cope with the stress of the car accident, and largely oblivious to the geographical danger they are in. Zegers gives Evan a playful, casual energy that serves to lower the audience's guard. His sudden disappearance and brutal off-screen slaughter establish that the woods are actively alive with malice. Lindy Booth as Francine. Lindy Booth portrays Francine, Evan's girlfriend. Booth gives Francine a manic, highly anxious energy that perfectly matches her character's predicament. Left alone after Evan goes missing, Francine wanders into the woods looking for him. Her discovery of his severed ear is a terrifying moment that Booth plays with blood-curdling realism. Her subsequent death, having her mouth sliced open by an unseen attacker from behind, is the film's first true display of graphic, slasher violence. Together, Zegers and Booth act as the sacrificial lambs necessary to kick the plot into high gear. 6. Gary Robbins as Sawtooth, the heavy brute. The antagonists of Wrong Turn are defined by their physical abnormalities, resulting from generations of inbreeding exacerbated by chemical mutations from runoff from nearby paper mills. Gary Robbins, a towering actor and former professional wrestler standing over 6 feet tall, plays Sawtooth, the largest and physically most intimidating of the 3 cannibal brothers. Julian Richings, known for his thin, angular frame and expressive face, brings an unsettling, hyperkinetic energy to Three Finger. Unlike the lumbering Sawtooth or the static One Eye, Three Finger is constantly in motion. He scurries up trees, leaps across rooftops, and moves through the forest canopy with the agility of a primate. Richings uses his background in physical theater to make Three Finger's movements feel completely unhuman and unpredictable. The cackle of pure malice. Richings does not speak a single word of dialogue, yet Three Finger is the most expressive villain in the film. He communicates through high-pitched, manic giggles, wheezing laughs, and clicking sounds. This vocal styling adds a deeply disturbing layer of sadism to the character. He clearly takes immense, childlike joy in the terror and torment of his victims. The anchor of the franchise. It is Richings' performance that secures Three Finger as the definitive survivor of the film's explosive climax. His survival in the mid-credit scene feels completely earned because Richings has spent the entire movie demonstrating the character's cockroach-like resilience, speed, and supernatural capacity to endure trauma. 9. The initial victims, Yvonne Gaudry as Hallie Smith and Joel Harris as Rich Stoker. The movie actually begins before Chris Flynn even hits the road. The prologue introduces us to Hallie Smith, Yvonne Gaudry, and Rich Stoker, Joel Harris, a pair of rock climbers who serve as the narrative's opening hook. Yvonne Gaudry as Hallie Smith. Gaudry plays Hallie with an athletic, confident energy that highlights her status as an outdoorswoman. Her inclusion at the start of the film is a clever piece of narrative misdirection. The audience assumes that because she is a skilled climber equipped with professional gear, she stands a good chance of defending herself. Gaudry's sudden, terrifying vertical abduction, being hauled up into the cliffside canopy by an invisible thread, instantly sets a tone of absolute vulnerability. Joel Harris as Rich Stoker. Harris plays Rich, Hallie's climbing partner. His role is brief but impactful. He is killed off-screen while pulling Hallie up the cliff face, his sudden death signaled by a spray of blood dropping onto Hallie's face. Harris's performance is defined by its abrupt termination, a stark warning to the audience that in these mountains, death strikes from above and without warning. 10. The supporting elements, the enablers and the law. Rounding out the cast are the characters who represent the sparse, hostile human infrastructure of the West Virginia backcountry. Wayne Robson as Old Man, Maynard. Veteran character actor Wayne Robson plays the Old Man at the gas station, a character later identified in the lore as Maynard Audits. Robson delivers a masterclass in sinister, backwoods hospitality. He is filthy, spitting tobacco juice, and projecting a false sense of senile unhelpfulness. Robson's performance is crucial for the film's subtextual dread. He acts as the gatekeeper to the slaughterhouse. By misdirecting Chris down the old dirt road, he deliberately feeds the travelers to his cannibalistic kin. Robson plays the character with a subtle, underlying malice hidden beneath a layer of rural decay. David Hubban plays the unnamed state trooper who enters the narrative during the third act. Hubban plays the officer with a mundane, routine professionalism that serves as a tragic contrast to the extreme horror unfolding around him. He is a man just doing his daily rounds, completely unaware that he has stepped into a sovereign zone governed by monsters. His swift, unceremonious execution by Sawtooth emphasizes that the standard protections of civil society are completely null and void in this wilderness. James Downing as Trucker. James Downing appears briefly as a trucker on the main highway, interacting with Chris during the traffic spill. His brief appearance serves a simple, realistic world-building function. He establishes that the outside world is normal, busy, and completely disconnected from the prehistoric nightmare occurring just a few miles off the main road. Summary of cast dynamics and character fates. The collective effort of the Wrong Turn cast results in a highly effective, tightly paced horror engine. The actors playing the victims successfully ground the film in recognizable human emotion, making their terror palpable and their survival highly desired by the audience. Concurrently, the actors behind the prosthetics transform the antagonists into unforgettable symbols of rural dread. Performer character narrative archetype ultimate fate in the story. Desmond Harrington Chris Flynn the pragmatic medical student survives and escapes the mountains. Eliza Dushku Jesse Burlingame the tough, resilient final girl survives and escapes alongside Chris Emmanuel Trikakala the anxious, vulnerable friend decapitated by an axe in the watchtower. Jeremy Sisto Scott the protective, heroic fiancé shot by multiple arrows while creating a distraction. Kevin Zegers Evan the laid-back stoner slaughtered off-screen. At the disabled SUV. Lindy Booth Francine the terrified, manic girlfriend throat sliced open behind the disabled SUV. Ted Clark one eye the silent, calculating archer seemingly incinerated in the cabin explosion. Julian Richings three-finger the agile, cackling predator survives the explosion to kill the deputy. Yvonne Gaudry Hallie Smith the athletic cliff climber draggled into the trees and murdered in prologue. Joel Harris Rich Stoker the unsuspecting rock climber murdered on the cliffside in prologue. David Hubban Trooper the out of his depth lawman shot dead through the chest by Sawtooth. Wayne Robson Old Man the malicious gas station enabler left alive, map stolen by Chris at the end. James Downing Trucker the mundane highway outside remains safe on the main highway grid. The Journey of Wrong Turn, 2003, from a simple, anxiety-inducing real-life moment to a highly successful, generation-defining horror movie is a fascinating study in independent film financing, cross-border production, grueling practical stunts, and strategic audio design. While the on-screen narrative focuses on primitive, backwoods terror, the behind-the-scenes reality of the film was a sophisticated operation that bridged Hollywood creative minds with the booming Canadian production infrastructure of the early 2000s. By deconstructing the development cycle, the rigorous and frequently hazardous filming process, and the dual-pronged musical landscape of the movie, we can fully appreciate how director Rob Schmidt, writer Alan B. McElroy, and a dedicated creative team resurrected the raw, gritty aesthetic of 1970s survival horror for a modern audience. 1. The Development Matrix, reviving 1970s dread in 2001. The genesis of Wrong Turn began in 2001, a specific period in cinematic history when American horror was searching for a new identity. The late 1990s had been dominated by slick, self-aware, meta-slasher films characterized by teenage casts who knew the rules of horror movies. While highly profitable, this trend had begun to burn itself out, leaving audiences craving something more visceral, grounded, and genuinely terrifying. The Summit and Newmarket Alliance. To bring a dirtier, more unforgiving brand of horror back to theaters, two heavyweights of independent film production and distribution joined forces, Summit Entertainment and the Newmarket Group. Summit Entertainment. At this point in its history, Summit was primarily known as a powerful foreign sales agent and production company, adept at maximizing international value and identifying highly marketable high-concept scripts. Newmarket Group. Newmarket was fresh off massive critical and financial triumphs in the indie scene, notably having distributed Christopher Nolan's Memento in 2000. They brought a reputation for backing edgy, unconventional, and director-driven projects. Together, these entities recognized that there was a massive, untapped market for an uncompromising, R-rated survival film. Their explicit mission statement from the outset was to create a 1970s-style horror film, a direct throwback to the raw, unpolished, and relentless tension found in masterpieces like Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, 1977, and Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. They wanted to strip away the pop culture wisecracks of the late 90s slashers and replace them with isolated, sweating, blood-soaked terror. The selection of director Rob Schmidt. To helm this gritty revival, the producers selected Rob Schmidt. Schmidt was an up-and-coming filmmaker who had turned heads in the independent film circuit with his 2000 dark thriller Crime and Punishment in Suburbia. Schmidt possessed a sharp, contemporary visual style but also harbored a deep appreciation for the classical, atmospheric horror of the 1970s. His task was to take a straightforward, primal concept and execute it with high-tension cinematic techniques, ensuring the film felt both nostalgic and modern. 2. Alan B. McElroy's script, From Real-Life Panic to Cinematic Nightmare. The creative spine of Wrong Turn belongs to screenwriter Alan B. McElroy. McElroy was far from a novice when he sat down to pen the script. He had a rich pedigree in the horror and action genres, having launched his professional screenwriting career over a decade earlier with the highly regarded Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, 1988. He knew how to structure a slasher film, how to pace a chase, and how to build a mythos around an antagonist. The real-life inspiration. The core concept of Wrong Turn did not emerge from a desire to copy past films, but from a moment of intense, personal vulnerability. McElroy and his wife were driving through a remote, rural area during a severe winter snowstorm. Up ahead on the main highway, a massive traffic collision had blocked all lanes, completely grinding travel to a halt. Desperate to keep moving and escape the worsening weather, McElroy made the split-second decision to veer off the highway and take an unmapped, isolated side road. As the vehicle drifted deeper into the pitch-black darkness of the rural countryside, surrounded by swirling snow and dead cell phone reception, a wave of profound existential dread washed over the writer. McElroy began questioning the safety of his decision, thinking to himself, is this a smart idea? Anything could go wrong. If our car breaks down, if we slide off the road, or if we encounter someone hostile out here, no one in the world knows where we are. McElroy took that exact feeling of sudden, terrifying isolation and transplanted it into a cinematic environment. He swapped the winter snowstorm for the dense, claustrophobic heat of the West Virginia wilderness, but kept the catalyst identical. A traffic accident on the main interstate, caused by a chemical spill in the film, forces a pragmatic, hurried protagonist, Chris Flynn, to seek an alternate route via an old, unmapped logging trail. McElroy's script excelled because it tapped into a universal, modern anxiety, the profound vulnerability that urban, technologically dependent people experience when they are suddenly severed from the grid and forced onto the home turf of primitive, predatory forces. 3. The Canadian wilderness for West Virginia, the filming logistics. While the narrative of Wrong Turn is explicitly, indelibly set deep within the backcountry of West Virginia, a state famous for its dense Appalachian forests, winding mountain passes, and rugged topography, the actual physical production never touched West Virginia soil. For reasons relating to budget optimization, tax incentives, and logistical infrastructure, the entire shoot was relocated to Canada. The Ontario Nature Reserve. The vast majority of the outdoor, on-location photography took place in a protected nature reserve located just north of Toronto, Ontario. Utilizing the Canadian wilderness to double for the American South or Mid-Atlantic was a common industry practice in the early 2000s, but it presented unique challenges for director Rob Schmidt and his cinematographer, John S. Bartley. Matching the flora and topography, the production team had to carefully select shooting locations within the Ontario Reserve that featured dense, ancient tree growth, thick underbrush, and rocky inclines that could convincingly mimic the oppressive, landlocked feel of the Appalachian Mountains. The element of scale, to make the characters feel truly lost, the camera work had to emphasize the verticality and infinity of the woods. The nature reserve provided a massive, uncontrolled canvas that allowed for genuine, sweeping wide shots where human actors looked like tiny ants swallowed by an endless ocean of green. Shooting an entire horror movie on location in a dense forest is notoriously difficult. The crew had to haul heavy camera rigs, lighting equipment, and generators deep into the woods, often through muddy, uneven terrain. Weather conditions were unpredictable, and the cast had to endure long hours exposed to the elements, insects, and the physical exhaustion of running, crawling, and tumbling through real dirt and brush. This environmental authenticity, however, paid massive dividends on screen. The sweat, dirt, and weariness visible on the actors' faces were largely genuine. 4. Stage photography and the Forest Station Tower. While the organic look of the forest was achieved on location in the nature reserve, certain sequences in Wrong Turn required a level of controlled action, complex lighting, and structural danger that could not be safely or effectively executed in the wilderness. For these specific set pieces, the production transitioned to indoor sound stages and meticulously constructed sets. The Fire Tower set. The most prominent example of this hybrid approach is the sequence set inside and around the abandoned forestry watchtower, or fire station tower. In the film, the surviving characters ascend this towering structure in a desperate attempt to find a radio, communicate with the outside world, and spot a way out of the woods, only to have the cannibals trap them at the top and set the base of the tower on fire. Executing a sequence involving actors trapped dozens of feet in the air while a structure burns beneath them is an operational nightmare on a real, outdoor location. Therefore, the production team built a highly detailed, full-scale replica of the tower station platform on a Toronto soundstage. This allowed for several critical advantages. Safety in pyrotechnics. The special effects team could precisely control the propane lines and fire placement, ensuring the flames looked terrifyingly close to actors Eliza Dushku, Desmond Harrington, and Emmanuel Tricky, without actually putting their lives at risk. Choreographed stunts. The stage environment allowed for the installation of overhead rigging, safety wires, and crash mats, which were essential for the sequences where characters are forced to climb out of the tower windows and drop into the surrounding tree canopy to escape the inferno. Optimal lighting control. Because the tower sequence takes place across an extended period of nighttime terror and dawn transition, shooting on a stage allowed the cinematographer to perfectly control the artificial moonlight, smoke density, and rising sun effects without being dictated by the actual, shifting clock of the natural world. 5. Practical stunts and Emmanuel Tricky's real-life injury. Director Rob Schmidt was determined to make Wrong Turn a tactile, physically grounded experience. In an era when Hollywood was becoming increasingly reliant on early computer-generated imagery, CGI, for action sequences and blood effects, Schmidt chose to rely almost exclusively on practical stunts, real prosthetics, and physical performances. This dedication to realism created a highly impactful horror film, but it also demanded an immense physical toll from the cast. The tree canopy fall. One of the most thrilling and hazardous sequences in the film occurs immediately after the characters escape the burning fire tower. To survive, they must leap from the high platform into the branches of the surrounding trees, navigating their way through the canopy while being actively hunted from above and below by the nimblest cannibal, Three Finger. During the shooting of this sequence, the script called for the character of Carly, played by Emmanuel Tricky, to fall violently through a series of heavy tree branches before being caught by her friends. While the production utilized safety harnesses, wire work, and padded branch replicas to minimize danger, the sheer physics of performing a high-velocity stunt in a confined space introduced a margin of error. During one of the takes of this complex fall, the mechanics of the stunt went awry. Tricky genuinely fell off her intended trajectory, colliding heavily with a structural element or a branch. The impact was severe enough to instantly dislocate her shoulder. Actress character stunt sequence real-life injury sustained Emmanuel Tricky Carla canopy escape a fall through branches severely dislocated shoulder. The injury was a significant blow to the production. Dislocating a shoulder causes intense, immediate agony and requires prompt medical intervention to reset the joint, followed by an extended period of immobilization to allow the torn ligaments and muscles to heal. The recovery and production pivot. Treacy's injury required weeks of recovery, forcing her to wear a sling and avoid any strenuous physical activity. For an independent film operating on a tight, unforgiving schedule, having a principal actor incapacitated during the height of the action unit's schedule could have been financially ruinous. The production team, however, managed the crisis with tactical efficiency. Schedule reordering. The directors rearranged the shooting matrix, shifting focus to scenes that focused exclusively on Chris, Desmond Harrington, and Jessie, Eliza Dushku, or sequences involving the cannibals tracking the group, buying Treacy precious time to heal. Stunt doubles and clever framing. When Treacy did return to the set, she was still in considerable discomfort and physically restricted. For the remaining wide shots and action beats, her stunt double handled the physical heavy lifting. For close-up dramatic shots, Schmidt framed the camera carefully to hide her restricted arm movement, allowing her to deliver her lines without exposing her physical vulnerability. This real-life pain and restriction inadvertently enhanced her performance, adding a deeper layer of authentic, exhausted trauma to Carly's on-screen demeanor. The first soundtrack release was dedicated entirely to the original film score composed by Elia Kmyril. Kmyril was a highly respected international composer born in Czechoslovakia, who had gained massive acclaim in Hollywood for his dark, moody, and tension-fueled score for the 1998 action thriller Ronin. Kmyril's approach to Wrong Turn was rooted in classical European avant-garde horror sensibilities. Instead of relying on loud, cheap jump-scare noises, Kmyril focused on building an overarching atmosphere of geographical isolation and inescapable doom. Dissonant orchestration. Kmyril utilized low-register brass, screeching strings, and unconventional percussion instruments to mimic the organic, unpredictable sounds of the forest. The music often sounded like wind howling through dry wood or the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a hidden predator. Thematic subconscious terror. The score was designed to make the audience feel lost. By avoiding clear, comforting melodic structures, Kmyril kept the viewers in a state of perpetual disorientation, perfectly reflecting the psychological state of Chris, Jessie, and their friends as they wandered deeper into the cannibals' territory. Album 2, the popular music companion, marketing to the youth culture. The second soundtrack release was a completely different product, curated specifically to tap into the thriving alternative music scene of 2003. The early 2000s marked the peak popularity of nu metal, post-grunge, and aggressive hard rock, genres that possessed a raw, angry energy that perfectly complemented the violent, high-stakes nature of a survival slasher. This commercial companion soundtrack featured a collection of licensed tracks from prominent alternative bands of the era. The inclusion of these artists served multiple critical functions for the film's life cycle. Cultural context. Playing aggressive, modern rock tracks during specific transitional moments or over the end credits instantly anchored the film within the youth culture of 2003. It signaled to the audience that despite its 1970s structural roots, Wrong Turn was a fast, energetic, and contemporary ride. Cross-promotional marketing. In 2003, music videos and rock radio airplay were vital tools for driving box office numbers. By aligning the film with popular rock acts, the studio was able to secure heavy rotation for movie-clip-infused music videos on networks like MTV and VH1, effectively converting music fans into horror movie ticket buyers. 7. The synergy of vision, how development, filming, and music cohesively formed a cult classic. When we look at the development, filming, and musical architecture of Wrong Turn, we see a project where every component was engineered to maximize tension and revitalize a classic horror format. The project succeeded because the behind-the-scenes execution perfectly matched the raw intensity of Alan B. McElroy's script. The contrast of settings. The production's ability to turn a controlled, regulated nature reserve in Ontario into an lawless, terrifying, and sweat-soaked West Virginia mountain range is a testament to the power of traditional filmmaking craftsmanship. By building full-scale sets like the Watchtower on indoor stages, director Rob Schmidt secured the absolute safety necessary to execute high-concept pyrotechnic stunts while maintaining an illusion of organic, outdoor peril. The human cost and realism. The real-life injury of Emmanuel Treacy stands as a stark reminder of the physical demands of practical filmmaking. In an era before actors could be easily duplicated or dropped through digital trees using green screens and computer code, the cast of Wrong Turn had to physically throw themselves into the environment. The resulting film possesses a weight and a tangible danger that modern, CGI-heavy horror films often struggle to replicate. The complementary audio. Finally, the dual soundtrack strategy ensured that the film operated perfectly on two levels. It satisfied traditional horror purists through Elia Kmiral's heavy, artistic, and deeply unsettling orchestral score, while simultaneously satisfying the commercial demands of the era's youth demographic through a high-octane rock companion album. The theatrical release, corporate history, commercial performance, and critical reception of the 2003 survival horror film Wrong Turn represent a fascinating intersection of cinematic trends at the turn of the millennium. Directed by Rob Schmidt and written by Alan B. McElroy, the film emerged at a highly specific point in Hollywood history. It was a time when independent co-financiers looked to major studios for theatrical muscle, while those same studios frequently struggled to market and distribute raw, unapologetically violent R-rated horror. Tracing the life cycle of Wrong Turn requires examining its initial May 2003 domestic launch via 20th Century Fox, its historic creature effects partnership, its immense regulatory battles with the Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA, its financial survival across global box offices, its harsh contemporary critical drubbing, and its unexpected modern corporate migration into the vast streaming library of the Walt Disney Company. 1. The theatrical launch and co-production infrastructure. On May 30, 2003, Wrong Turn arrived in United States theaters, distributed by 20th Century Fox. However, the film's journey to the big screen was not a traditional studio-driven pipeline. It was a complex co-production that brought together prominent independent financing entities, international production houses, and legendary Hollywood special effects royalty. The project was principally funded through a joint effort between Summit Entertainment and Constantin Film. Constantin Film, a historically significant German production and distribution giant, brought vast European market leverage, while Summit Entertainment maximized global sales strategies. To solidify its theatrical footprint in North America, the co-financiers struck a crucial domestic distribution agreement with 20th Century Fox and Regency Enterprises. This multi-tiered deal allowed the independent production to utilize the massive marketing machine, regional booking infrastructure, and nationwide theatrical network of a major Hollywood studio, granting a gritty, low-budget slasher film the scale of a mainstream studio release. The Stan Winston factor. One of the most prestigious elements of the film's production pedigree was the direct involvement of Stan Winston. Winston was a titan of Hollywood special effects, globally renowned for his Oscar-winning work on landmark films like Aliens, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, and Jurassic Park. For Wrong Turn, Winston did not merely design the intricate, grotesque prosthetic creature effects for the inbred cannibal brothers, Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye. He also stepped into the role of a hands-on producer. Winston's physical presence behind the scenes elevated the film's industry profile significantly. His studio crafted highly detailed, anatomically realistic practical suits and facial prosthetics that gave the antagonists a terrifyingly tangible, visceral presence on screen. Winston's involvement guaranteed that even if the film operated on a modest budget, its visual horrors would rival the highest caliber makeup effects in cinema history. 2. Censorship battles, the MPAA and the R-rating crisis. One of the most significant hurdles faced by 20th Century Fox during the distribution of Wrong Turn was navigating the increasingly conservative and stringent regulatory landscape of American film censorship. In 2003, the theatrical marketplace was heavily policed by the Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA, and the studio found itself locked in a grueling war of attrition over the film's extreme, unrelenting violence. The R-rating struggle. The MPAA initially pushed back aggressively against the raw cut of Wrong Turn. The film's script called for graphic depictions of body desecration, casual decapitations, victims being sliced open, and characters being hunted like livestock. Fox reportedly faced severe difficulties securing a commercially viable R rating, as early cuts of the film frequently veered dangerously close to the dreaded NC-17 rating. An NC-17 rating would have spelled financial disaster for a mainstream theatrical release, as major theater chains across America historically refused to screen NC-17 films, and prominent media outlets barred them from advertising. To avoid this kiss of death, the filmmakers were forced to make precise, frame-by-frame cuts to the gore, trimming the most extreme frames of violence to appease the ratings board while attempting to retain the film's core visceral impact. The television advertisement ban. The censorship battles extended far beyond the editing room of the feature film itself. They severely crippled the studio's promotional campaign. The MPAA's advertising administration consistently refused to approve many of the television spots and promotional trailers submitted by 20th Century Fox. The marketing department found itself unable to broadcast the film's most thrilling and impactful horror sequences on network television. Because horror relies heavily on visual hooks and shocking imagery to drive opening weekend ticket sales among young adult demographics, These widespread advertising rejections severely handcuffed Fox's ability to build mainstream awareness for the film. The direct-to-video legacy. This intense regulatory friction had a profound, permanent impact on the structural future of the Wrong Turn brand. The immense corporate exhaustion, financial costs, and logistical headaches associated with fighting the MPAA for a theatrical R rating convinced executives and producers that the theatrical model was fundamentally hostile to unfiltered survival horror. Consequently, when the film eventually proved to be a massive cult hit on home video platforms, the decision was made to bypass the theatrical system entirely for all future installments. The subsequent 5 sequels and various spin-offs were intentionally produced for the direct-to-video and straight-to-DVD markets. This strategic shift allowed the filmmakers to release unrated cuts that bypassed the MPAA's restrictions completely, feeding the core horror audience's insatiable appetite for extreme gore without the burden of theatrical distribution costs or censorship battles. 3. Financial performance, the global box office lifecycle. When evaluating the box office performance of Wrong Turn, it must be analyzed through the lens of a modestly budgeted, R-rated horror film operating without the benefit of a massive, unrestricted mainstream marketing push. Given the heavy censorship restrictions on its TV spots, the film's financial trajectory was steady and resilient rather than explosive. The domestic opening weekend. Wrong Turn debuted in the United States on the post-Memorial Day weekend of May 30, 2003. It opened across a moderate theatrical footprint of 1,615 screens nationwide. Over its initial 3-day opening weekend, the film generated a domestic box office gross of $5,161,498. An opening of roughly $5 million was considered a soft but respectable baseline for an independent co-production competing against massive, big-budget summer blockbusters. It demonstrated that despite limited television advertising, a dedicated core demographic of horror enthusiasts had actively sought out the film. Box office territory gross revenue, USD, percentage of total United States, domestic, $15, for 18, 79053.8% international markets $13, 231, 78546.2% worldwide total $28, 650, 575,100.0%. The long-tail box office run. Following its opening weekend, the film displayed solid legs in theaters, avoiding the catastrophic second-week drops that frequently plague modern horror releases. It eventually climbed to a final domestic gross of $15,418,790. Simultaneously, Summit Entertainment's international sales strategy bore fruit, as the film found strong resonance in overseas markets. Internationally, Wrong Turn pulled in an additional $13,231,785. When combining the domestic and international box office receipts, Wrong Turn finished its global theatrical run with a worldwide gross of $28,650,575. Given its controlled production budget, this worldwide total represented a solid financial success. It comfortably cleared its production and distribution overhead, paving the way for the incredibly lucrative home video and DVD rental market where the film would truly transform into a highly profitable cult franchise. 4. The critical backlash, contemporary reception in 2003. While the film found a loyal, enthusiastic audience among horror fans and turned a respectable profit, the mainstream critical establishment of 2003 was overwhelmingly hostile to Wrong Turn. The early 2000s marked a period where top-tier film critics were largely exhausted by the slasher subgenre, frequently viewing survival horror films as derivative, mean-spirited, and artistically bankrupt exercises in shock value. Aggregator metrics. The critical consensus across early internet review aggregators paints a grim picture of contemporary critical opinion. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, Wrong Turn holds a low approval rating of just 41% based on 82 collected reviews, with an average rating of a mediocre 4.5 out of 10. The site's critical consensus reflects the dismissive attitude of the era, labeling it an unremarkable slasher flick that fails to distinguish itself from others of its ilk. The metrics were even harsher on Metacritic, which employs a weighted average score. The site assigned the film a score of 32 out of 100 based on 17 critics, a rating that firmly denotes generally unfavorable reviews. Furthermore, general mass audiences polled by the market research firm CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of C on a standard A+ to F scale. This low score revealed that the raw, uncompromising brutality of the film's third act left casual moviegoers feeling intensely uncomfortable and disoriented. The mainstream critical assault. A deep dive into the specific reviews written by prominent film critics of the era reveals a deep-seated disdain for the movie's script and extreme gore. The Times' Barbara Ellen offered a scathing critique of the film's narrative execution, writing that the movie possessed the potential to be a half-decent cross between a Romero zombie movie and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. However, she concluded that, in the end, the gore is so ridiculously overdone and the script so lame, that it undermines all sense of suspense. The Austin Chronicle, Mark Savlov awarded the film a dismal 1 out of 4 stars. He attacked the movie for relying on ancient, recycled tropes, noting that this was already tired stuff when cult fave Sleepaway Camp came out in 1983, and it's downright comatose by now. The New York Times, Anita Gates dismissed the project entirely, calling it a lazy would-be horror film that failed to inject any fresh ideas or psychological depth into the survival genre. A particularly insightful critique came from Scott Founders of Variety, who focused his anger on 20th Century Fox's distribution strategy rather than the film itself. Founders heavily criticized Wrong Turn for being a negative pickup by Fox that was unceremoniously dumped into theaters on Friday without benefit of press previews. By bypassing traditional advance press screenings, Fox had tipped its hand to the industry that it lacked confidence in the film's mainstream appeal, a move that Founders argued doomed the film to a reception of frightless torpor. Amidst this sea of critical negativity, the film did receive a few notable stamps of approval from genre-sympathetic outlets. William Thomas, writing for the prestigious British film magazine Empire, provided a lone beacon of high praise. Thomas explicitly stated that Wrong Turn was better than any of the official Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequels. Which is probably a good thing. Thomas recognized what mainstream American critics missed, that beneath its simple B-movie plot, Wrong Turn was a tightly paced, technically competent, and highly energetic survival film that executed its foundational genre mechanics with absolute precision. The post-theatrical history of Wrong Turn took an extraordinary corporate turn more than a decade and a half after its initial release. The film shifted from a gritty independent co-production distributed by Fox into a piece of intellectual property owned by one of the largest family-friendly entertainment conglomerates on Earth, the Walt Disney Company. The Disney-Fox acquisition. In 2019, entertainment mogul Rupert Murdoch orchestrated a historic corporate restructuring, selling the vast majority of 21st Century Fox's film and television assets to Disney in a monumental $71.3 billion acquisition. This corporate megamerger saw historic properties like Avatar, X-Men, and The Simpsons transfer to the Disney banner. Was facing an industry-wide challenge. Its signature streaming platform, Disney Plus, was highly successful at capturing family demographics, but it was lagging behind competitors like Netflix and HBO Max in retaining mature, adult audiences. To combat this, corporate leadership decided to aggressively integrate the R-rated and TVMA content acquired from the Fox catalog into the domestic Disney Plus library. In April 2022, Wrong Turn made history. In an effort to appeal to these mature audiences instead of just family viewers, the 2003 slasher was selected as one of the very first R-rated films, and the first ever traditional gore-heavy horror film, to be officially released directly on Disney Plus in the United States. The Canadian rescheduling. This historic domestic streaming experiment was short-lived. The jarring contrast of placing a movie featuring Stan Winston-designed cannibalistic butcherings on the same platform as Mickey Mouse and Cinderella sparked internal corporate re-evaluations regarding brand alignment in the United States. Consequently, the decision to host Wrong Turn on the primary domestic US Disney Plus platform was eventually dropped. The corporate distribution team pivoted, shifting the film's streaming home over to international territories like Canada. In Canada, adult-oriented Fox content was cleanly partitioned under the mature Star hub within the Disney Plus application. This corporate relocation allowed Disney to successfully monetize the cult horror asset globally while safely insulating its core family brand identity in the domestic market. 6. The historical contextualization of Wrong Turn's life cycle. When looking back at the macro history of Wrong Turn from its release in 2003 through its corporate journeys in the streaming era, it becomes clear that the film's financial and cultural survival is far more impressive than its contemporary critics gave it credit for. It weathered severe structural challenges at every single phase of its life cycle. The survival of practical craft. During its production phase, the film survived the financial anxieties of a multi-studio independent alliance by anchoring its creative identity to the legendary practical effects mastery of Stan Winston. By forcing real actors to perform grueling practical stunts inside a Canadian nature reserve, it captured a visceral, tactile reality that allowed it to stand the test of time far better than the flat, CGI-heavy horror films that dominated the later part of the decade. Victory over censorship and critics. During its distribution phase, Wrong Turn successfully overcame an immense systemic campaign of suppression. It fought through extensive MPAA censorship that threatened to neuter its cinematic identity, survived a devastating television advertisement ban that crippled its primary marketing outreach, and withstood a unified assault from the mainstream critical establishment that branded it as dead on arrival. Despite these obstacles, it generated nearly $30 million worldwide in theaters and built a massive, fiercely loyal home video fanbase that sustained a 6-film franchise spanning nearly 2 decades. A masterclass in genre resilience. Ultimately, the film's bizarre journey from a censored 20th Century Fox summer negative pickup to an experimental, historic R-rated pioneer on Disney Plus proves the enduring, unkillable nature of the survival horror genre. Wrong Turn did not need the validation of high critical scores or pristine corporate alignment to secure its legacy.